Preface of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sherlock85. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Preface. In writing this series of historical narratives to which the present work pertains, it has been the object of the author to furnish to the reading community of this country an accurate and faithful account of the lives and actions of the several personages that are made successively the subjects of the volumes, following precisely the story which has come down to us from ancient times. The writer has spared no pains to gain access in all cases to the original sources of information, and has confined himself strictly to them. The reader may, therefore, feel assured in perusing any one of these works that the interest of it is in no degree indebted to the invention of the author. No incident, however trivial, is ever added to the original account, nor are any words even in any case attributed to a speaker without express authority. Whatever of interest, therefore, these stories may possess is due solely to the facts themselves which are recorded in them, and to their being brought together in a plain, simple, and connected narrative.
Chapter 1 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Garvin. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 1. Cadmus, B.C. 1500. Some men are renowned in history on account of the extraordinary powers and capabilities which they exhibited in the course of their career, or the intrinsic greatness of the deeds which they performed. Others, without having really achieved anything in itself very great or wonderful, have become widely known to mankind by reason of the vast consequences which, in the subsequent course of events, resulted from their doings. Men of this latter class are conspicuous rather than great. From among thousands of other men equally exalted in character with themselves, they are brought out prominently to the notice of mankind only in the consequence of the strong light reflected, by great events subsequently occurring, back upon the position where they happen to stand. The celebrity of Romulus seems to be of this latter kind. He founded a city. 1,000 other men have founded cities, and in doing their work have evinced perhaps as much courage, sagacity, and mental power as Romulus displayed. The city of Romulus, however, became in the end the queen and mistress of the world. It rose to so exalted a position of influence and power, and retained its ascendancy so long, that now for 20 centuries every civilized nation in the Western world have felt a strong interest in everything pertaining to its history, and have been accustomed to look back with special curiosity to the circumstances of its origin. In consequence of this, it has happened that though Romulus, in his actual day, performed no very great exploits, and enjoyed no preeminence above the 1,000 other half-savage chieftains of his class, whose names have been long forgotten, and very probably while he lived never dreamed of any extended fame, yet so brilliant is the illumination which the subsequent events of history have shed upon his position and his doings, that his name and the incidents of his life have been brought out very conspicuously to view, and attract very strongly the attention of mankind. The history of Rome is usually made to begin with the story of Aeneas. In order that the reader may understand in what light that romantic tale is to be regarded, it is necessary to premise some statements in respect to the general condition of society in ancient days, and to the nature of the strange narrations circulated in those early periods among mankind, out of which in later ages, when the art of writing came to be introduced, learned men compiled and recorded what they termed history. The countries which formed the shores of the Mediterranean Sea were as verdant and beautiful in those ancient days, and perhaps as fruitful and as densely populated as in modern times. The same Italy and Greece were there then as now. There were the same blue and beautiful seas, the same mountains, the same picturesque and enchanting shores, the same smiling valleys, and the same serene and genial sky. The level lands were tilled industriously by a rural population corresponding in all essential points of character with the peasantry of modern times, and shepherds and herdsmen, then as now, hunted the wild beasts and watched their flocks and herds on the declivities of the mountains. In a word, the appearance of the face of nature, and the performance of the great function of the social state, namely, the procuring of food and clothing for man by the artificial cultivation of animal and vegetable life, were substantially the same on the shores of the Mediterranean 2000 years ago as now. Even the plants and the animals themselves which the ancient inhabitants reared have undergone no essential change. Their sheep and oxen and horses were the same as ours. So were their grapes, their apples, and their corn. If, however, we leave the humbler classes and occupations of society, and turn our attention to those which represent the refinement, the cultivation, and the power of the two respective periods, we shall find that almost all analogy fails. There was an aristocracy then as now, ruling over the widely extended communities of peaceful agriculturalists and herdsmen, but the members of it were entirely different in their characters, their tastes, their ideas, and their occupations from the classes which exercise the prerogatives of government in Europe in modern times. The nobles then were military chieftains, living in camps or in walled cities, which they built for the accommodation of themselves and their followers. These chieftains were not barbarians. They were in a certain sense cultivated and refined. They gathered around them in their camps and in their courts orators, poets, statesmen, and officers of every grade, who seem to have possessed the same energy, genius, taste, and in some respects the same scientific skill, which have in all ages and in every clime characterized the upper classes of the Caucasian race. They carried all the arts which were necessary for their purposes and plans to high perfection, and in the invention of tales, ballads, and poems, to be recited at their entertainments and feasts, they evinced the most admirable taste and skill. A taste and skill which, as they resulted not from the operation and influence of artificial rules, but from the unerring instinct of genius, have never been surpassed. In fact, the poetical inventions of those early days, far from having been produced in conformity with rules, were entirely precedent to rules in the order of time. Rules were formed from them, for they at length became established themselves in the estimation of mankind, as models, and on their authority as models, the whole theory of rhetorical and poetical beauty now mainly reposes. The people of those days formed no idea of a spiritual world, or of a spiritual divinity. They, however, imagined that heroes of former days still continued to live and to reign in certain semi-heavenly regions among the summits of their blue and beautiful mountains, and that they were invested there with attributes in some respects divine. In addition to these divinities, the fertile fancy of those ancient times filled the earth, the air, the sea, and the sky with imaginary beings, all most graceful and beautiful in their forms, and poetical in their functions, and made them the subjects, too, of innumerable legends and tales, as graceful, poetical, and beautiful as themselves. Every grove and fountain and river, every lofty summit among the mountains, and every rock and promontory along the shores of the sea, every cave, every valley, every waterfall, had its imaginary occupant, the genius of the spot, so that every natural object which attracted public notice at all was the subject of some picturesque and romantic story. In a word, nature was not explored then as now, for the purpose of ascertaining and recording cold and scientific realities, but to be admired, and embellished, and animated, and to be peopled everywhere with exquisitely beautiful, though imaginary and supernatural, life and action. What the genius of imagination and romance did thus in ancient times with the scenery of nature, it did also on the field of history. Men explored that field, not at all to learn sober and actual realities, but to find something that they might embellish and adorn, and animate with supernatural and marvellous life. What the sober realities might have actually been, was of no interest or moment to them whatever. There were no scholars then as now, living in the midst of libraries, and finding constant employment, and a never-ending pleasure in researches for the simple investigation of the truth. There was in fact no retirement, no seclusion, no study. Everything except what related to the mere daily toil of tilling the ground bore direct relation to military expeditions, spectacles, and parades, and the only field for the exercise of that kind of intellectual ability which is employed in modern times in investigating and recording historic truth was the invention and recitation of poems, dramas, and tales, to amuse great military audiences in camps or public gatherings, convened to witness shows or games, or to celebrate great religious festivals. Of course, under such circumstances there would be no interest felt in truth as truth. Romance and fable would be far more serviceable for such ends than reality. Still, It is obvious that such tales as were invented to amuse for the purposes we have described, would have a deeper interest for those who listen to them, if founded in some measure upon fact, and connected in respect to the scene of their occurrence with real localities. A prince and his court sitting at their tables in the palace or the tent, at the close of a feast, would listen with greater interest to a story that purported to be an account of the deeds and the marvellous adventures of their own ancestors, than to one that was wholly and avowedly imaginary. The inventors of these tales would of course generally choose such subjects, and their narrations would generally consist therefore rather of embellishments of actual transactions than of inventions wholly original. Their heroes were consequently real men, the principal actions ascribed to them were real actions, and the places referred to were real localities. Thus there was a semblance of truth and reality in all these tales, which added greatly to the interest of them, while there were no means of ascertaining the real truth, and thus spoiling the story by making the falsehood or improbability of it evident and glaring. We cannot well have a better illustration of these principles than is afforded by the story of Cadmus, an adventurer who was said to have brought the knowledge of alphabetic writing into Greece from some countries farther eastward. In modern times there is a very strong interest felt in ascertaining the exact truth on this subject. The art of writing with alphabetic characters was so great an invention, and it has exerted so vast an influence on the condition and progress of mankind since it was introduced, that a very strong interest is now felt in everything that can be ascertained as actually fact, in respect to its origin. If it were possible now to determine under what circumstances the method of representing the elements of sound by written characters was first devised, to discover who it was that first conceived the idea, and what led him to make the attempt, what difficulties he encountered, to what purposes he first applied his invention, and to what results it led, the whole world would take a very strong interest in the revelation. The essential point, however, is to be observed, is that it is the real truth in respect to the subject that the world are now interested in knowing. Were a romance writer to invent a tale in respect to the origin of writing, however ingenious and entertaining it might be in its details, it would excite in the learned world at the present day no interest whatever. There is in fact no account at present existing in respect to the actual origin of alphabetic characters, though there is an account of the circumstances under which the art was brought into Europe from Asia, where it seems to have been originally invented. We will give the facts, first in their simple form, and then the narrative in the form in which it was related in ancient times, as embellished by the ancient storytellers. The facts, then, as now generally understood and believed, are that there was a certain king in some country in Africa named Agenor, who lived about 1500 years before Christ. He had a daughter named Europa, and several sons. Among his sons was one named Cadmus. Europa was a beautiful girl, and after a time a wandering adventurer from some part of the northern shores of the Mediterranean Sea came into Africa, and was so much pleased with her that he resolved, if possible, to obtain her for his wife. He did not dare to make proposals openly, and he accordingly disguised himself and mingled with the servants upon Agenor's farm. In this disguise he succeeded in making acquaintance with Europa, and finally persuaded her to elope with him. The pair accordingly fled, and crossing the Mediterranean they went to Crete, an island near the north shores of the sea, and there they lived together. The father, when he found that his daughter had deceived him and gone away, was very indignant, and sent Cadmus and his brothers in pursuit of her. The mother of Europa, whose name was Telephassa, though less indignant perhaps than the father, was overwhelmed with grief at the loss of her child, and determined to accompany her sons in the search. She accordingly took leave of her husband and of her native land, and set out with Cadmus and her other sons on the long journey to search for her lost child. Agenor charged his sons never to come home again unless they brought Europa with them. Cadmus, with his mother and brothers, travelled slowly toward the northward, along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea, inquiring everywhere for the fugitive. They passed through Syria and Phoenicia into Asia Minor, and from Asia Minor into Greece. At length Telephassa, worn down perhaps by fatigue, disappointment, and grief, died. Cadmus and his brothers soon after became discouraged, and at last, weary with their wanderings, and prevented by their father's injunction from returning without Europa, they determined to settle in Greece. In attempting to establish themselves there, however, they became involved in various conflicts, first with wild beasts, and afterward with men. the natives of the land, who seemed to spring up, as it were, from the ground, to oppose them. They contrived, however, at length, by fomenting quarrels among their enemies, and taking sides with one party against the rest, to get a permanent footing in Greece, and Cadmus finally founded a city there, which he called Thebes. In establishing the institutions and government of Thebes, and in arranging the organization of the people into a social state, Cadmus introduced among them several arts, which, in that part of the country, had been before unknown. One of these arts was the use of copper, which metal he taught his new subjects to procure from the ore obtained in mines. There were several others, but the most important of all was that he taught them 16 letters representing elementary vocal sounds, by means of which inscriptions of words could be carved upon monuments, or upon tablets of metal or of stone. It is not supposed that the idea of representing the elements of vocal sounds by characters originated with that Cadmus, or that he invented the characters himself. He brought them with him undoubtedly, but whether from Egypt or Phoenicia cannot now be known. Such are the facts of the case, as now generally understood and believed. Let us now compare this simple narration with the romantic tale which the early storytellers made from it. The legend, as they relate it, is as follows. Jupiter was a prince born and bred among the summits of Mount Ida in Crete. His father's name was Saturn. Saturn had made an agreement that he would cause all his sons to be slain as soon as they were born. This was to appease his brother, who was his rival, and who consented that Sauron should continue to reign only on that condition. Jupiter's mother, however, was very unwilling that her boys should be thus cruelly put to death, and she contrived to conceal 3 of them, and save them. The 3 thus preserved were brought up among the solitudes of the mountains, watched and attended by nymphs, and nursed by a goat. After they grew up, they engaged from time to time in various wars, and met with various wonderful adventures, until at length Jupiter, the oldest of them, succeeded, by means of thunderbolts which he caused to be forged for his use, in vast subterranean caverns beneath Mount Etna and Mount Vesuvius, conquered all his enemies, and became universal king. He, however, divided his empire between himself and his brothers, giving to them respectively the command of the sea and of the subterranean regions, while he reserved the earth and the heavenly regions for himself. He established his usual abode among the mountains of northern Greece, but he often made excursions to and fro upon the earth, appearing in various disguises, and meeting with a great number of strange and marvellous adventures. In the course of these wanderings he found his way at one time into Egypt, and to the dominion of Agenor, and there he saw Agenor's beautiful daughter, Europa. He immediately determined to make her his bride, and to secure this object he assumed the form of a very finely shaped and beautiful bull, and in this guise joined himself to Agenor's herds of cattle. Europa soon saw him there. She was much pleased with the beauty of his form, and finding him gentle and kind in disposition, she approached him, patted his glossy neck and sides, and in other similar ways gratified the prince by marks of her admiration and pleasure. She was at length induced by some secret and magical influence which the prince exerted over her, to mount upon his back and allow herself to be borne away. The bull ran with his burden to the shore, and plunged into the waves. He swam across the sea to Crete, and there, resuming his proper form, he made the princess his bride. Agenor and Telephassa, when they found that their daughter was gone, were in great distress, and Agenor immediately determined to send his sons on an expedition in pursuit of her. The names of his sons were Cadmus, Phoenix, Cyclix, Thasus, and Phineus. Cadmus, as the oldest son, was to be the director of the expedition. Telephassa, the mother, resolved to accompany them, so overwhelmed was she with affliction at the loss of her daughter. Agenor himself was almost equally oppressed with the calamity which had overwhelmed him, and he charged his sons never to come home again until they could bring Europa with them. Telephassa and her sons wandered for a time in the countries east of the Mediterranean Sea, without being able to obtain any tidings of the fugitive. At length they passed into Asia Minor, and from Asia Minor into Thrace, a country lying north of the Aegean Sea. Finding no traces of their sister in any of these countries, the sons of Agenor became discouraged, and resolved to make no further search, and Telephassa, exhausted with anxiety and fatigue, and now overwhelmed with the thought that all hope must be finally abandoned, sank down and died. Cadmus and his brothers were much affected at their mother's death. They made arrangements for her burial, in a manner befitting her high rank and station, and when the funeral solemnities had been performed, Cadmus repaired to the oracle at Delphi, which was situated in the northern part of Greece, not very far from Thrace, in order that he might inquire there whether there was anything more that he could do to recover his lost sister, and if so, to learn what course he was to pursue. The oracle replied to him that he must search for his sister no more, but instead of it turn his attention wholly to the work of establishing a home and a kingdom for himself in Greece. To this end he was to travel on in a direction indicated until he met with a cow of a certain kind, described by the oracle, and then to follow the cow wherever she might lead the way, until at length, becoming fatigued, she should stoop and lie down. Upon the spot where the cow should lie down he was to build a city and make it his capital. Cadmus obeyed these directions of the oracle. He left Delphi and went on, attended, as he had been in all his wanderings, by a troop of companions and followers, until at length in the herds of one of the people of the country, named Pelagon, he found a cow answering to the description of the oracle. Taking this cow for his guide, he followed wherever she led the way. She conducted him toward the southward and eastward for 30 or 40 miles, and at length, wearied apparently by her long journey, she lay down. Cadmus knew immediately that this was the spot where his city was to stand. He began immediately to make arrangements for the building of the city, but he determined first to offer the cow that had been his divinely appointed guide to the spot as a sacrifice to Minerva, whom he always considered as his guardian goddess. Near the spot where the cow lay down there was a small stream which issued from a fountain not far distant, called the Fountain of Dirce. Cadmus sent some of his men to the place to obtain some water which it was necessary to use in the ceremonies of the sacrifice. It happened, however, that this fountain was a sacred one, having been consecrated to Mars, and there was a great dragon, a son of Mars, stationed there to guard it. The men whom Cadmus sent did not return, and accordingly Cadmus himself, after waiting a suitable time, proceeded to the spot to ascertain the cause of the delay. He found that the dragon had killed his men, and at the time when he arrived at the spot the monster was greedily devouring the bodies. Cadmus immediately attacked the dragon and slew him, and then tore his teeth out of his head, as trophies of his victory. Minerva had assisted Cadmus in this combat, and when it was ended she directed him to plant the teeth of the dragon in the ground. Cadmus did so, and immediately a host of armed men sprang up from the place where he had planted them. Cadmus threw a stone among these armed men, and when they immediately began to contend together in a desperate conflict, until at length all but 5 of them were slain. These 5 then joined themselves to Cadmus, and helped him to build his city. He went on very successfully after this. The city which he built was Thebes, which afterwards became greatly celebrated. The citadel which he erected within he called, from his own name, Cadmea. Such were the legends which were related in ancient poems and tales, and it is obvious that such narratives must have been composed to entertain groups of listeners whose main desire was to be excited and amused, and not to be instructed. The stories were believed, no doubt, and the faith which the hearer felt in their truth added, of course, very greatly to the interest which they awakened in his mind. The stories are amusing to us, but it is impossible for us to share in the deep and solemn emotion with which the ancient audiences listened to them, for we have not the power, as they had, of believing them. Such tales, related in respect to the great actors on the stage in modern times, would awaken no interest, for there is too great a diffusion both of historical and philosophical knowledge to render it possible for any one to suppose them to be true. But those for whom the story of Europa was invented had no means of knowing how wide the Mediterranean Sea might be, and whether a bull might not swim across it. They did not know but that Mars might have a dragon for a son, and that the teeth of such a dragon might not, when sown in the ground, spring up in the form of a troop of armed men. They listened therefore to the tale with an interest in all the more earnest and solemn in account of the marvellousness of the recital. They repeated it word for word to one another, around their campfires, at their feasts, in their journeyings, and when watching their flocks at midnight, among the solitudes of the mountains. Thus the tales were handed down from generation to generation, until at length the use of the letters of Cadmus became so facilitated that continuous narrations could be expressed by means of them, and then they were put permanently upon record in many forms, and thus were transmitted without any further change to the present age. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Garvin. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 2. Cadmus' Letters, BC 1500. There are 2 modes essentially distinct from each other, by which ideas may be communicated through the medium of descriptions addressed to the eye. These two modes are, first, by symbolical, and second, by phonetic characters. Each of these two systems assumes, in fact, within itself, quite a variety of distinct forms, though it is only the general characteristics which distinguish the two great classes from each other that we shall have occasion particularly to notice here. Symbolical writing consists of characters intended severally to denote ideas or things, and not words. A good example of true symbolical writing is to be found in a certain figure often employed among the architectural decorations of churches, as an emblem of the deity. It consists of a triangle representing the Trinity, with the figure of an eye in the middle of it. The eye is intended to denote the divine omniscience. Such a character as this is obviously the symbol of an idea, not the representation of a word. It may be read Jehovah, or God, or the deity, or by any other word or phrase by which men are accustomed to denote the Supreme Being. It represents, in fine, the idea, and not any particular word by which the idea is expressed. The first attempts of men to preserve the records of facts by means of inscriptions have, in all ages and among all nations, been of this character. At first, the inscriptions so made were strictly pictures, in which the whole scene intended to be commemorated was represented in rude carvings. In process of time, substitutions and abridgments were adapted in lieu of full representations, and these grew at length into a system of hieroglyphical characters, some natural, and others more or less arbitrary, by all denoting ideas or things, and not the sounds of words. These characters are of the kind usually understood by the word hieroglyphics, though that word can not now with strict accuracy be applied as a distinctive appellation, since it has been ascertained in modern times that a large portion of the Egyptian hieroglyphics are of such a nature as brings them within the second of the two classes which we are here describing, that is, the several delineations represent the sounds and syllables of words, instead of being symbols of ideas or things. It happened that in some cases in the species of writing, as used in ancient times, the characters which were employed presented in their form some natural semblance of the thing signified, and in other cases they were wholly arbitrary. Thus the figure of a sceptre denoted a king, that of a lion strength, and two warriors, one with a shield and the other advancing toward the first with a bow and arrow, represented a battle. We use in fact a symbol similar to the last mentioned one at the present day, upon maps, where we often see a character formed by two swords crossed, employed to represent a battle. The ancient Mexicans had a mode of writing which seems to have been symbolical in its character, and their characters had, many of them at least, a natural signification. The different cities and towns were represented by drawings of such simple objects as were characteristic of them respectively, as a plant, a tree, an article of manufacture, or any other object by which the place in question was most easily and naturally to be distinguished from other places. In one of their inscriptions, for example, there was a character representing a king, and before it 4 heads. Each of the heads was accompanied by the symbol of the capital of a province, as above described. The meaning of the whole inscription was that in a certain tumult or insurrection the king caused the governors of the 4 cities to be beheaded. But though, in this symbolical mode of writing, a great many ideas and events could be represented thus, by means of signs or symbols having a greater or less resemblance to the thing signified, yet in many cases the characters used were wholly arbitrary. They were in this respect like the character which we use to denote dollars, as a prefix to a number expressing money. For this character is a sort of symbol, that is, it represents a thing rather than a word. Our numerals too, 1, 2, 3, etc., are in some respects of the character of symbols, that is, they stand directly for the numbers themselves, and not for the sounds of the words by which the numbers are expressed. Hence, although the people of different European nations understand them all alike, they read them, in words, very differently. The Englishman reads them by one set of words, the Spaniard by another, and the German and the Italian by others still. The symbolical mode of writing possesses some advantages which must not be overlooked. It speaks directly to the eye, and is more full of meaning than the phonetic method, though the meaning is necessarily more vague and indistinct, in some respects, while it is less so in others. For example, in an advertising newspaper, the simple figure of a house, or of a ship, or of a locomotive engine, at the head of an advertisement, is a sort of hieroglyphic, which says much more plainly and distinctly, and in much shorter time than any combination of letters could do, that which follows is an advertisement relating to a house, or a vessel, or a railroad. In the same manner, the ancient representations on monuments and columns would communicate, perhaps more rapidly and readily to the passer-by, an idea of the battles, the sieges, the marches, and the other great exploits of the monarchs whose history they were intended to record, than an inscription in words would have done. Another advantage of the symbolical representation as used in ancient times was that their meaning could be more readily explained, and would be more easily remembered, and so explained again, than written words. To learn to read literal writing in any language is a work of very great labour. It is, in fact, generally found that it must be commenced early in life, or it cannot be accomplished at all. An inscription, therefore, in words, on a Mexican monument that a certain king suppressed an insurrection, and beheaded the governors of 4 of his provinces, would be wholly blind and unintelligible to the mass of the population of such a country. And if the learned sculptor who inscribed it were to attempt to explain it to them, letter by letter, they would forget the beginning of the lesson before reaching the end of it, and could never be expected to attempt extending the knowledge by making known the interpretation which they had received to others in their turn. But the royal sceptre, with the 4 heads before it, each of the heads accompanied by the appropriate symbol of the city to which the possessor of it belonged, formed a symbolical congeries, which expressed its meaning at once, and very plainly, to the eye. The most ignorant and uncultivated could readily understand it. Once understanding it too, they could never easily forget it, and they could, without any difficulty, explain it fully to others as ignorant and uncultivated as themselves. It might seem, at first view, that a symbolical mode of writing must be more simple in its character than the system now in use, inasmuch as by that plan each idea or object would be expressed by one character alone, whereas, by our mode of writing, several characters, sometimes as many as 8 or 10, are required to express a word, which word, after all, represents only one single object or idea. And notwithstanding this apparent simplicity, the system of symbolical writing proved to be, when extensively employed, extremely complicated and intricate. It is true that each idea required but one character, but the number of ideas and objects, and of words expressive of their relations to one another, is so vast that the system of representing them by independent symbols soon lost itself in an endless intricacy of detail. Then, besides, notwithstanding what has been said of the facility with which symbolical inscriptions could be interpreted, they were, after all, extremely difficult to be understood without interpretation. An inscription once explained, the explanation was easily understood and remembered, but it was very difficult to understand one intended to express any new communication. The system was, therefore, well adapted to commemorate what was already known, but was of little service as a mode of communicating knowledge anew. We come now to consider the second grand class of written characters, namely the phonetic, the class which Cadmus introduced into Greece, and the one almost universally adopted among all European nations at the present day. It is called phonetic from a Greek word denoting sound, because the characters which are used do not denote directly the thing itself which is signified, but the sounds made in speaking the word which signifies it. Take, for instance, the 2 modes of representing a conflict between 2 contending armies, one by the symbolic delineation of 2 swords crossed, and the other by the phonetic delineation of the letters of the word battle. They are both inscriptions. The beginning of the first represents the handle of the sword, a part, as it were, of the thing signified. The beginning of the second, the letter B, represents the pressing of the lips together, by which we commence pronouncing the word. Thus the one mode is symbolical, and the other phonetic. On considering the 2 methods, as is exemplified in this simple instance, we shall observe that what has already been pointed out as characteristic of the 2 modes is here seen to be true. The idea is conveyed in the symbolical mode of 1 character, while by the phonetic it requires no less than 6. This seems at first view to indicate a great advantage possessed by the symbolical system, but on reflection this advantage is found entirely to disappear. For the symbolical character, though it is only 1, will answer for only the single idea which it denotes. Neither itself nor any of its elements will aid us in forming a symbol for any other idea. And as the ideas, objects, and relations which it is necessary to be able to express, in order to make free and full communications in any language, are from 50 to 100,000, the step which we have taken, though very simple in itself, is the beginning of a course which must lead to the most endless intricacy and complication. Whereas in the 6 phonetic characters of the word battle, we have elements which can be used again and again in the expression of thousands of other ideas. In fact, as the phonetic characters which are found necessary in most languages are only about 24, we have in that single word accomplished 1/4 of the whole task, so far as the delineation of characters is concerned, that is necessary for expressing by writing any possible combination of ideas which human language can convey. At what time and in what manner the transition was made among the ancient nations from the symbolic to the phonetic mode of writing is not now known. When in the flourishing periods of the Grecian and Roman states, learned men explored the literary records of the various nations of the East, writings were found in all, which were expressed in phonetic characters, and the alphabets of these characters were found to be so analogous to each other in the names and order, and in some respects in the form, of the letters, as to indicate strongly something like community of origin. All the attempts, however, which have been made to ascertain the origin of the system have wholly failed, and no account of them goes farther back than to the time when Cadmus brought them from Phoenicia or Egypt into Greece. The letters which Cadmus brought were in number 16. The following table presents a view of his alphabet, presenting in the several columns the letters themselves as subsequently written in Greece, the Greek names given to them, and their power as represented by the letters now in use. The forms, it will be seen, have been but little changed. Greek name Alpha, English representative A, Beta B, Gamma G, Delta D, Epsilon E, Iota I, Kappa K, Lambda L, Mu M, Nu N, Omicron O, Pi P, Rho R, Sigma S, Tau T, Upsilon U. The phonetic alphabet of Cadmus, though so vastly superior to any system of symbolical hieroglyphics, for all purposes where anything like verbal accuracy was desired, was still very slow in coming into general use. It was, of course, at first very difficult to write it, and very difficult to read it when written. There was a very great practical obstacle, too, in the way of its general introduction, in the want of any suitable materials for writing. To cut letters with a chisel and a mallet upon a surface of marble is a very slow and toilsome process. To diminish this labour the ancients contrived tables of brass, copper, lead, and sometimes of wood, and cut the inscriptions upon them by the use of various tools and implements. Still, it is obvious that by such methods as these the art of writing could only be used to an extremely limited extent, such as for brief inscriptions in registers and upon monuments, where a very few words would express all that it was necessary to record. In process of time, however, the plan of painting the letters by means of a black dye upon a smooth surface was introduced. The surface employed to receive these inscriptions was, at first, the skin of some animal prepared for this purpose, and the dye used for ink was a coloured liquid obtained from a certain fish. This method of writing, though in some respects more convenient than the others, was still slow, and the materials were expensive, and it was a long time before the new art was employed for anything like continuous composition. Cadmus is supposed to have come into Greece about the year 1550 before Christ, and it was not until about 650 before Christ, that is nearly 900 years later, that the art of writing was resorted to in Greece to record laws. The evidences that writing was very little used in any way during this long period of 900 years are furnished in various allusions contained in poems and narratives that were composed during those times, and committed to writing afterward. In the poems of Homer, for instance, there is no allusion, from the beginning to the end, to any monument or tomb containing any inscription whatever, although many occasions occur in which such inscriptions would have been made if the events described were real, and the art of writing had been generally known, or would have been imagined to be made, if the narratives were invented. In one case a shipmaster takes a cargo on board, and he is represented as having to remember all the articles, instead of making a record of them. Another case still more striking is adduced. In the course of the contest around the walls of Troy, the Grecian leaders are described at one time as drawing lots to determine which of them should fight a certain Trojan champion. The lots were prepared, being made of some substance that could be marked, and when ready, were distributed to the several leaders. Each one of the leaders then marked his lot in some way, taking care to remember what character he had made upon it. The lots were then all put into a helmet, and the helmet was given to a herald, who was to shake it about in such a manner, if possible, as to throw out one of the lots and leave the others in. The leader whose lot it was that should be thus shaken out was to be considered as the one designated by the decision to fight the Trojan champion. Now in executing this plan, the herald, when he had shaken out a lot, and had taken it up from the ground, is represented in the narrative as not knowing whose it was, and as carrying it around, accordingly, to all the different leaders, to find the one who could recognize it as his own. A certain chief named Ajax recognized it, and in this way he was designated for the combat. Now it is supposed that if these men had been able to write, that they would have inscribed their own names upon the lots, instead of marking them with unmeaning characters. And even if they were not practised writers themselves, some secretary or scribe would have been called upon to act for them on such an occasion as this, if the art of writing had been at that time so generally known as to be customarily employed on public occasions. From these and similar indications which are found, on a careful examination, in the Homeric poems, learned men have concluded that they were composed and repeated orally, at a period of the world when the art of writing was very little known, and that they were handed down from generation to generation, through the memory of those who repeated them, until at last the art of writing became established among mankind, when they were at length put permanently upon record. It seems that writing was not much employed for any of the ordinary and private purposes of life by the people of Greece until the article called papyrus was introduced among them. This took place about the year 600 before Christ, when laws began first to be written. Papyrus, like the art of writing upon it, came originally from Egypt. It was obtained from a tree which it seems grew only in that country. The tree flourished in the low lands, among the margin of the Nile. It grew to the height of about 10 feet. The paper obtained from it was formed from a sort of inner bark, which consisted of thin sheets or pellicles growing round the wood. The paper was manufactured in the following manner. A sheet of the thin bark as taken from the tree was laid flat upon a board, and then a cross layer was laid over it, the materials having been previously moistened with water made slightly glutinous. The sheet thus formed was pressed and dried in the sun. The placing of 2 layers of the bark in this manner across each other was intended to strengthen the texture of the sheet, for the fibers, it was found, were very easily separated and torn so long as they lay wholly in one direction. The sheet, when dry, was finished by smoothing the surface, and prepared to receive inscriptions made by means of a pen fashioned from a reed or a quill. In forming the papyrus into books, it was customary to use a long sheet or web of it, and roll it upon a stick, as is the custom in respect to maps at the present day. The writing was in columns, each of which formed a sort of page, the reader holding the ends of the roll in his 2 hands, and reading at the part which was open between them. Of course, as he advanced, he continually unrolled on one side, and rolled up upon the other. Rolls of parchment were often made in the same manner. The term volume, used in respect to modern books, had its origin in this ancient practice of writing upon long rolls. The modern practice is certainly much to be preferred, though the ancient one was far less inconvenient than might first be supposed. The long sheet was rolled upon a wooden billet, which gave to the volume a certain firmness and solidity, and afforded it great protection. The ends of this roller projected beyond the ends of the sheet, and were terminated in knobs or bosses, which guarded in some measure the edges of the papyrus or of the parchment. The whole volume was also enclosed in a parchment case, on the outside of which the title of the work was conspicuously recorded. Many of these ancient rolls have been found at Herculaneum. For ink, various colored liquids were used, generally black, but sometimes red and sometimes green. The black ink was sometimes manufactured from a species of lamp black or ivory black, such as is often used in modern times for painting. Some specimens of the inkstands which were used in ancient times have been found at Herculaneum, and one of them contained ink, which, though too thick to flow readily from the pen, it was still possible to write with. It was of about the consistency of oil. These rolls of papyrus and parchment, however, were only used for important writings which it was intended permanently to preserve. For ordinary occasions, tablets of wax or similar materials were used, upon which the writer traced the characters with the point of a steel instrument called a style. The head with the style was smooth and rounded, so that any words which the writer wished to erase might be obliterated by smoothing over again with it the wax upon which they had been written. Such is a brief history of the rise and progress of the art of writing in the states of Greece. Whether the phonetic principle which Cadmus introduced was brought originally from Egypt, or from the countries on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, cannot now be ascertained. It has generally been supposed among mankind, at least until within a recent period, that the art of phonetic writing did not originate in Egypt, for the inscriptions on all the ancient monuments in that country are of such a character that it has always been supposed that they were symbolical characters altogether, and that no traces of any phonetic writing existed in that land. Within the present century, however, the discovery has been made that a large portion of these hieroglyphics are phonetic in their character, and that the learned world, in attempting for so many centuries, in vain, to fix symbolical meanings to them, have been altogether upon the wrong track. The delineations, though they consist almost wholly of the forms of plants and animals, and of other natural and artificial objects, are not symbolical representations of ideas, but letters representing sounds and words. They are thus precisely similar, in principle, to the letters of Cadmus, though wholly different from them in form. To enable the reader to obtain a clearer idea of the nature of this discovery, we give on the adjoining page some specimens of Egyptian inscriptions found in various parts of the country, and which are interpreted to express the name Cleopatra, a very common name for princesses of the royal line in Egypt during the dynasty of the Ptolemies. We mark the various figures forming the inscription, with the letters which modern interpreters have assigned to them. It will be seen that they all spell, rudely indeed, but yet tolerably distinctly, the name Cleopatra. By a careful examination of these specimens, it will be seen that the order of placing the letters, if such hieroglyphical characters can be so called, is not regular, and the letter A, which is denoted by a bird in some of the specimens, is represented differently in others. There are also two characters at the close of each inscription which are not represented by any letter, the one being of the form of an egg, and the other a semicircle. These last are supposed to denote the sex of the sovereign whose name they are connected with, as they are found in many cases in inscriptions commemorative of princes and queens. They are accordingly specimens of symbolic characters, while all the others in the name are phonetic. It seems therefore not improbable that the principle of forming a written language by means of characters representing the sounds of which the words of the spoken language are composed was of Egyptian origin, and that it was carried in very early times to the countries on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, and there improved upon by the adoption of a class of characters more simple than the hieroglyphics of Egypt, and of a form more convenient for a regular linear arrangement in writing. Moses, who spent his early life in Egypt, and who was said to be learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, may have acquired the art of writing there. However this may be, and whatever may be the uncertainty which hangs over the early history of this art, one thing is certain, and that is that the discovery of the art of writing, including that of printing, which is only the consummation and perfection of it, the art by which man can record language, and give life and power to the record to speak to the eye permanently and forever, to go to every nation, to address itself simultaneously to millions of minds, and to endure throughout all time, is by far the greatest discovery, in respect to the enlargement which it makes of human powers, that has ever been made. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 3. The Story of Aeneas. B.C. 1200. Besides the intrinsic interest and importance of the facts stated in the last chapter, to the student of history there was a special reason for calling the attention of the reader to them here, that he might know in what light the story of the destruction of Troy and of the wanderings of Aeneas, the great ancestor of Romulus, which we now proceed to relate, is properly to be regarded. The events connected with the destruction of Troy took place if they ever occurred at all, about the year 1200 before Christ. Homer is supposed to have lived and composed his poems about the year 900, and the art of writing is thought to have been first employed for the purpose of recording continuous compositions about the year 600. The story of Aeneas, then, so far as it has any claims to historical truth, is a tale which was handed down by oral tradition among storytellers for 300 years, and then was clothed in verse and handed down in that form orally by the memory of the reciters of it, in generations successive, for 300 years more before it was recorded. And during the whole period of this transmission, the interest felt in it was not the desire for ascertaining and communicating historic truth, but simply for entertaining companies of listeners with the details of a romantic story. The story, therefore, cannot be relied upon as historically true, but it is no less important on that account that well-informed persons should know what it is. The mother of Aeneas, as the story goes, was a celebrated goddess. Her name was Aphrodite, though among the Romans she afterward received the name of Venus. Aphrodite was not born of a mother like ordinary mortals, but sprang mysteriously and supernaturally from a foam which gathered on a certain occasion upon the surface of the sea. At the commencement of her existence she crept out upon the shores of an island that was near the island of Cythera, which lies south of the Peloponnesus. She was the goddess of love, of beauty, and of fruitfulness, and so extraordinary were the magical powers which were inherent from the beginning in her very nature, that as she walked along upon the sands of the shore, when she first emerged from the sea, plants and flowers of the richest verdure and beauty sprang up at her feet wherever she stepped. She was, besides, in her own person, inexpressibly beautiful, and in addition to the natural influence of her charms, she was endued with supernatural power of inspiring the sentiment of love in all who beheld her. From Cythera the goddess made her way over by sea to Cyprus, where she remained for some time amid the gorgeous and magnificent scenery of that enchanting island. Here she had two children, beautiful boys. Their names were Eros and Anteros. Each of these children remained perpetually a child, and Eros, in later times called Cupid, became the god of love bestowed, while Antares was the god of love returned. After this the mother and the boys roamed about the world, now in the heavenly regions above, and now among mortals on the plains and in the valleys below. They sometimes appeared openly in their true forms, sometimes they assumed disguises, and sometimes they were wholly invisible. But whether seen or unseen, they were always busy in performing their functions, the mother inspiring everywhere in the minds both of gods and men the tenderest sentiments of beauty and desire, while Eros awakened love in the heart of one person for another, and Anteros made it his duty to tease and punish those who thus became objects of affection. if they did not return the love. After some time, Aphrodite and her boys found their way to the heavenly regions of Mount Olympus, where the great divinities resided, and there they soon produced great trouble by enkindling the flames of love in the hearts of the divinities themselves, causing them by her magic power to fall in love, not only with one another, but also with mortal men and women on the earth below. In retaliation upon Aphrodite for her mischief, Jupiter, by his supreme power, inspired Aphrodite herself with a sentiment of love. The object of her affection was Anchises, a handsome youth of the royal family of Troy, who lived among the mountains of Ida, not far from the city. The way in which it happened that the affection of Aphrodite turned toward an inhabitant of Mount Ida was this. There had been at one time a marriage among the divinities, and a certain goddess, who had not been invited to the wedding, conceived the design of avenging herself for the neglect, by provoking a quarrel among those who were there. She accordingly caused a beautiful golden apple to be made, with an inscription marked upon it, "For the most beautiful." This apple she threw in among the guests assembled at the wedding. The goddesses all claimed the prize, and a very earnest dispute arose among them in respect to it. Jupiter sent the several claimants under the charge of a special messenger to Mount Ida, to a handsome and accomplished young shepherd there named Paris, who was in fact a prince in disguise, that they might exhibit themselves to him and submit the question of the right to the apple to his award. The contending goddesses appeared accordingly before Paris, and each attempted to bribe him to decide in her favor by offering him some peculiar tempting reward. Paris gave the apple to Aphrodite, and she was so pleased with the result that she took Paris under her special protection, and made the solitudes of Mount Ida one of her favorite retreats. Here she saw and became acquainted with Anchises, who was, as has already been said, a noble or prince by descent, though he had for some time been dwelling away from the city, and among the mountains, rearing flocks and herds. Here Aphrodite saw him, and when Jupiter inspired her with a sudden susceptibility to the power of love, the shepherd Anchises was the object toward which her affections turned. She accordingly went to Mount Ida, and giving herself up to him, she lived with him for some time among the mountains as his bride. Aeneas was their son. Aphrodite did not, however, appear to Anchises in her true character, but assumed instead the form and the disguise of a Phrygian princess. Phrygia was a kingdom of Asia Minor, not very far from Troy. She continued this disguise as long as she remained with Anchises at Mount Ida. At length, however, she concluded to leave him, and to return to Olympus, and at her parting she made herself known. She, however, charged Anchises never to reveal to any person who she was, declaring that Aeneas, whom she was going to leave with his father when she went away, would be destroyed by a stroke of lightning from heaven if the real truth in respect to his mother were ever revealed. When Aphrodite had gone, Anchises, having now no longer any one at home to attend to the rearing of the child, sent him to Dardanus, a city to the northward of Troy, where he was brought up in the house of his sister, the daughter of Anchises, who was married and settled there. His having a sister old enough to be married would seem to show that youth was not one of the attractions of Anchises in Aphrodite's eyes. Aeneas remained with his sister until he was old enough to be of service in the care of flocks and herds, and then returned again to his former residence among the pasturages of the mountains. His mother, though she had left him, did not forget her child, but watched over him continually, interposed directly to aid or protect him whenever her aid was required by the occurrence of any emergency of difficulty or danger. At length the Trojan War broke out. For a time, however, Aeneas took no part in it. He was jealous of the attentions which Priam, the king of Troy, paid to other young men, and fancied that he himself was overlooked and that the services that he might render were undervalued. He remained therefore at his home among the mountains, occupying himself with his flocks and herd, and he might perhaps have continued in these peaceful avocations to the end of the war, had it not been that Achilles, one of the most formidable of the Grecian leaders, in one of his forays in the country around Troy in search of provisions, came upon Aeneas's territory and attacked him while tending his flocks upon the mountainside. Achilles seized the flocks and herds and drove Aeneas and his fellow herdsmen away. They would, in fact, all have been killed had not Aphrodite interposed to protect her son and save his life. The loss of his flocks and herds and the injury which he himself had received aroused Aeneas's indignation and anger against the Greeks. He immediately raised an armed force of Dardanians, and thenceforth took an active part in the war. He became one of the most distinguished among the combatants for his prowess and his bravery, and being always assisted by his mother in his conflicts and rescued by her when in danger, he performed prodigies of strength and valor. At one time he pressed forward into the thickest of the battle to rescue a Trojan leader named Pandarus, who was beset by his foes and brought into very imminent danger. Aeneas did not succeed in saving his friend. Pandarus was killed. Aeneas, however, flew to the spot, and by means of the most extraordinary feats of strength and valor, he drove the Greeks away from the body. They attacked it on every side, but Aeneas, wheeling around it and fighting now on this side and now on that, drove them all away. They retired to a little distance, and then began to throw in a shower of spears and darts and arrows upon him. Aeneas defended himself and the body of his friend from these missiles for a time with his shield. At length, however, he was struck in the thigh with a ponderous stone, which one of the Greek warriors hurled at him, a stone so heavy that 2 men of ordinary strength would have been required to lift it. Aeneas was felled to the ground by the blow. He sank down, resting upon his arm, faint and dizzy, and being thus made helpless, would have immediately been overpowered and killed by his assailants had not his mother interposed. She came immediately to his rescue. She spread her veil over him. which had the magic power of rendering harmless all blows which were aimed at what was covered by it. And then, taking him up in her arms, she bore him off through the midst of his enemies unharmed. The swords, spears, and javelins which were aimed at him were rendered powerless by the magic veil. Aphrodite, however, flying thus with her wounded son, mother-like, left herself exposed in her anxiety to protect him. Diomedes, the chief of the pursuers, following headlong on, aimed a lance at Venus herself. The lance struck Venus in the hand and inflicted a very severe and painful wound. It did not, however, stop her flight. She pressed swiftly on, while Diomedes, satisfied with his revenge, gave up the pursuit, but called out to Aphrodite as she disappeared from view, bidding her learn from the lesson which he had given her that it would be best for her thenceforth to remain in her own appropriate sphere, and not come down to the earth and interfere in the contest of mortal men. Aphrodite, after conveying Aeneas to a place of safety, fled herself, faint and bleeding, to the mountains, where, after ascending to the region of mist and clouds, Eris, the beautiful goddess of the rainbow, came to her aid. Eris found her faint and pale from the loss of blood. She did all in her power to soothe and comfort the wounded goddess, and then led her father, still among the mountains, to a place where they found Mars, the god of war, standing with his chariot. Mars was Aphrodite's brother. He took compassion upon his sister in her distress, and lent Eris his chariot and horses to convey Aphrodite home. Aphrodite ascended into the chariot, and Eris took the reins, and thus they rode through the air to the mountains of Olympus. Here the gods and goddesses of heaven gathered around their unhappy sister, bound up her wound, and expressed great sympathy for her in her sufferings, uttering at the same time many piteous complaints against the merciless violence and inhumanity of men. Such is the ancient tale of Aeneas and his mother. At a later period in the history of the war, Aeneas had a grand combat with Achilles, who was the most terrible of all the Grecian warriors, and was regarded as the grand champion of their cause. The two armies were drawn up in battle array. A vast open space was left between them on the open plain. Into this space the two combatants advanced, Aeneas on the one side and Achilles on the other, in full view of all the troops and of the throngs of spectators assembled to witness the proceedings. A very strong and universal interest was felt in the approaching combat. Aeneas, besides the prodigious strength and bravery for which he was renowned, was to be divinely aided, it was known, by the protection of his mother, who was always at hand to guide and support him in the conflict, and to succor him in danger. Achilles, on the other hand, possessed a charmed life. He had been dipped by his mother, Thetis, when an infant, in the river Styx, to render him invulnerable and immortal, and the immersion produced the effect intended in respect to all those parts of the body which the water laved, as, however, Thetis held the child by the ankles when she plunged him in, the ankles remained unaffected by the magic influence of the water. All the other parts of the body were rendered incapable of receiving a wound. Achilles had a very beautiful and costly shield which his mother had caused to be made for him. It was formed of 5 plates of metal. The outermost plates of each side were of brass. In the center was a plate of gold, and between the central plate of gold and the outer ones of brass were 2 other plates, one on each side, made of some third metal. The workmanship of this shield was of the most elaborate and beautiful character. The mother of Achilles had given this weapon to her son when he left home to join the Greeks in the Trojan War, not trusting entirely, it seems, to his magical invulnerability. The armies looked on with great interest as these 2 champions advanced to meet each other, while all the gods and goddesses surveyed the scene with almost equal interest from their abodes above. Some joined Venus in the sympathy while she felt for her son, while others espoused the cause of Achilles. When the 2 combatants had approached each other, they paused before commencing the conflict, as is usual in such cases, and surveyed each other with looks of anger and defiance. At length Achilles spoke. He began to upbraid Aeneas for his infatuation and folly in engaging in the war, and especially for coming forward to put his life at hazard by encountering such a champion as was now before him. "What can you gain?" said he. "Even if you conquer in this warfare, you can never be king. Even if you succeed in saving the city, I know you claim to be descended from the royal line, but Priam has sons who are the direct and immediate heirs, and your claims can never be allowed. Then, besides, what folly to attempt to contend with me, the strongest, bravest, and most terrible of the Greeks, and the special favorite of many deities." With this introduction, Achilles went on to set forth the greatness of his pedigree and the loftiness of his pretensions to superiority over all others in personal prowess and valor, in a manner very eloquent indeed, and in a style which it seems was very much admired in those days, as evincing only a proper spirit and energy, though in our times such a harangue would be very apt to be regarded as only a vainglorious and empty boasting. Aeneas replied, retorting with vauntings on his own side, no less spirited and energetic than those which Achilles had expressed. He gave a long account of his pedigree and of his various claims to lofty consideration. He, however, said in conclusion that it was idle and useless for them to waste their time in such a war of words. So he hurled his spear at Achilles with all his force as a token of the commencement of the battle. The spear struck the shield of Achilles and impinged upon it with such force that it penetrated through 2 of the plates of metal which composed the shield, and reached the center plate of gold, where the force with which it had been thrown being spent, it was arrested and fell to the ground. Achilles then, exerting his utmost strength, threw his spear in return. Aeneas crouched down to avoid the shock of the weapon, holding his shield at the same time above his head, and bracing himself with all his force against the approaching concussion. The spear struck the shield near the upper edge of it, as it was held in Aeneas's hands. It passed directly through the plates of which the shield was composed, and then continuing its course, it glided down just over Aeneas's back, and planted itself deep in the ground behind him, and stood there quivering. Aeneas crept out from beneath it with a look of horror. Immediately after throwing his spear, and perceiving that it had failed of its intended effect, Achilles drew his sword and rushed forward to engage Aeneas hand to hand. Aeneas himself, recovering in an instant from the consternation which his narrow escape from impalement had awakened, seized an enormous stone, heavier, as Homer represents it, than any two ordinary men could lift, and was about to hurl it at his advancing foe, when suddenly the whole combat was terminated by a very unexpected interposition. It seems that the various gods and goddesses from their celestial abodes among the summits of Olympus had assembled in invisible forms to witness this combat, some sympathizing with and upholding one of the combatants, and some the other. Neptune was on Aeneas's side, and accordingly, when he saw how imminent the danger was which threatened Aeneas, when Achilles came rushing upon him with his uplifted sword, he at once resolved to interfere. He immediately rushed himself between the combatants. He brought a sudden and supernatural mist over the scene, such as the god of the sea has always at his command, and this mist at once concealed Aeneas from Achilles' view. Neptune drew the spear out of the ground, and released it too from the shield which remained still pinned down by it, and then threw the spear down at Achilles' feet. He next seized Aeneas, and lifting him high above the ground, he bore him away in an invisible form over the heads of soldiers and horsemen that had been drawn up in long lines around the field of combat. When the mist passed away, Achilles saw his spear lying at his feet, and on looking around him found that his enemy was gone. Such are the marvelous tales which were told by the ancient narrators of the prowess and exploits of Aeneas under the walls of Troy, and of the interpositions which were put forth to save him in moments of desperate danger by beings supernatural and divine. These tales were in those days believed as sober history. That which was marvelous and philosophically incredible in them was scarcely sheltered from question by mingling itself with the prevailing principles of religious faith. The tales were thus believed and handed down traditionally from generation to generation, and admired and loved by all who heard and repeated them, partly on account of their romantic and poetical beauty, and partly on account of the sublime and sacred revelations which they contained in respect to the divinities of the spiritual world. End of chapter 3. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Chapter 4 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sundiata. Romulus, by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 4. The Destruction of Troy, BC 1200. After the final conquest and destruction of Troy, Aeneas, in the course of his wanderings, stopped, it was said, at Carthage on his way to Italy, and there, according to ancient story, he gave the following account of the circumstances attending the capture and the sacking of the city, and his own escape from the scene. One day, after the war had been continued with various success for a long period of time, the sentinels on the walls and towers of the city began to observe extraordinary movements in the camp of the besiegers, which seemed to indicate preparations for breaking up the camp and going away. Tents were struck. Men were busy passing to and fro, arranging arms and military stores, as if for transportation. A fleet of ships was drawn up along the shore, which was not far distant, and a great scene of activity manifested itself upon the bank, indicating an approaching embarkment. In a word, the tidings soon spread throughout the city that the Greeks had at length become weary of the protracted contest, and were making preparations to withdraw from the field. These proceedings were watched, of course, with great interest from the walls of the city, and at length the inhabitants, to their inexpressible joy, found their anticipations and hopes, as they thought, fully realized. The camp of the Greeks was gradually broken up, and at last entirely abandoned. The various bodies of troops were drawn off one by one to the shore, where they were embarked on board the ships, and then sailed away. As soon as this result was made sure, the Trojans drew open the gates of the city and came out in throngs, soldiers and citizens, men, women, and children together, to explore the abandoned encampment and to rejoice over the departure of their terrible enemies. The first thing which attracted their attention was an immense wooden horse, which stood upon the ground that the Greek encampment had occupied. The Trojans immediately gathered, one and all, around the monster, full of wonder and curiosity. Aeneas, in narrating the story, says that the image was as large as a mountain, but as he afterward relates that the people drew it on wheels within the walls of the city, and especially as he represents them as attaching the ropes for this purpose to the neck of the image instead of to its forelegs, which would have furnished the only proper points of attachment if the effigy had been of an very extraordinary size. He must have had a very small mountain in mind in making the comparison, or, which is perhaps more probable, he used the term only in a vague metaphorical sense, as we do now when we speak of the waves of the ocean as running mountain high, when it is well ascertained that the crest of the billows, even in the most violent and most protracted storms, never rise more than 20 feet above the general level. At all events, the image was large enough to excite the wonder of all the beholders. The Trojan people gathered around it, wholly unable to understand for what purpose the Greeks could have constructed such a monster to leave behind them on their departure from Troy. After the first emotions of astonishment and wonder which the spectacle awakened had somewhat subsided, there followed a consultation in respect to the disposal which was to be made of the prodigy. The opinions on this point were very various. One commander was disposed to consider the image a sacred prize, and recommended that they should convey it into the city and deposit it in the citadel as a trophy of victory. Another, dissenting decidedly from this counsel, said that he strongly suspected some latent treachery, and he proposed to build a fire under the body of the monster and burn the monster itself and all contrivances for mischief which might be contained in it together. A third recommended that they should hew it open and see for themselves what there might be within. One of the Trojan leaders, named Laocoon, who just at this juncture came to the spot, remonstrated loudly and earnestly against having anything to do with so mysterious and suspicious a prize, and by way of expressing the strong animosity which he felt toward it, he hurled his spear with all his force against the monster's side. The spear stood trembling in the wood, producing a deep, hollow sound by the concussion. What the decision would have been in respect to the disposal of the horse, if this consultation and debate had gone on, it is impossible to say, as the farther consideration of the subject was all at once interrupted by new occurrences which are suddenly intervened, and which, after engrossing for a time the whole attention of the company assembled, finally controlled the decision of the question. A crowd of peasants and shepherds were seen coming from the mountains with much excitement and loud shouts and outcries, bringing with them a captive Greek whom they had secured and bound. As the peasants came up with their prisoner, the Trojans gathered eagerly round them, full of excitement and threats of violence, all thirsting apparently for their victim's blood. He, on his part, filled the air with the most piteous lamentations and cries for mercy. His distress and wretchedness, and the earnest entreaties which he uttered, seemed at length to soften the hearts of his enemies, and finally the violence of the crowd around the captive became somewhat appeased, and was succeeded by a disposition to question him and hear what he had to say. The Greek told them, in answer to their interrogations, that his name was Sinon, and that he was a fugitive from his own countrymen, the Greeks, who had been intending to kill him. He said that the Greek leaders had long been desirous of abandoning the siege of Troy, and that they had made many attempts to embark their troops and sail away, but that the winds and seas had risen against them on every such attempt and defeated their design. They then sent a consult, the oracle of Apollo, to learn what was the cause of the displeasure and hostility thus manifested against them by the god of the sea. The oracle replied that they could not depart from Troy till they had first made an atoning and propitiatory offering by the sacrifice of a man, such an one as Apollo himself might designate. When this answer was returned, the whole army, as Sinon said, was thrown into a state of consternation. No one knew but that the fatal designation might fall on him. The leaders were, however, earnestly determined on carrying the measure into effect. Ulysses called upon Calchas, the priest of Apollo, to point out the man who was to die. Calchas waited day after day for 10 days before the divine intimation was made to him in respect to the individual who was to suffer. At length he said that Sinon was the destined victim. His comrade Sinon said, rejoicing in their own escape from so terrible a doom, eagerly assented to the priest's decision, and immediately made preparations for the ceremony. The altar was reared, the victim was adorned for the sacrifice, and the garlands, according to the accustomed usage, were bound upon his temples. He contrived, however, he said, at the last moment to make his escape. He broke the bands with which he had been bound and fled into a morass near the shore, where he remained concealed in inaccessible thickets until the Greeks had sailed away. He then came forth and was at length seized and bound by the shepherds of the mountains, who found him wandering about in extreme destitution and misery. Sinon concluded his tale by the most piteous lamentations on his wretched lot. The Trojans, he supposed, would kill him, and the Greeks, on their return to his native land, in their anger against him for having made his escape from them, would destroy his wife and children. The air and manner with which Sinon told his story seemed so sincere, and so natural and unaffected were the expressions of wretchedness and despair with which he ended his narrative, that the Trojan leaders had no suspicion that it was not true. Their compassion was moved for the wretched fugitive, and they determined to spare his life. Priam, the aged king, who was present at the scene in the midst of the Trojan generals, ordered the cords with which the peasants had bound the captive to be sundered, that he might stand before them free. The king spoke to him too, in a kind of encouraging manner. "Forget your countrymen," said he, "they are gone. Henceforth you shall be one of us. We will take care of you. And now," he continued, "tell us what this monstrous image means. Why did the Greeks make it, and why have they left it here?" Sinon, as if grateful for the generosity with which his life had been spared, professed himself ready to give his benefactors the fullest information. He told them that the wooden horse had been built by the Greeks to replace a certain image of Pallas, which they had previously taken and borne away from Troy. It was to replace this image, Sinon said, that the Greeks had built the wooden horse, and their purpose in making the image of this monstrous size was to prevent the possibility of the Trojans taking it into the city, and thus appropriating to themselves the benefit of its protecting efficacy and virtue. The Trojans listened with breathless interest to all that Sinon said, and readily believed his story. So admirably well did he counterfeit by his words and his demeanor all the marks and tokens of honest sincerity in what he said of others, as well of grief and despair in respect to his own unhappy lot. The current of opinion, which had begun before to set strongly in favor of destroying the horse, was wholly turned, and all began at once to look upon the colossal image as an object of sacred veneration, and to begin to form plans for transporting it within the limits of the city. Whatever remaining doubts any of them might have felt on the subject were dispelled by the occurrence of a most extraordinary phenomenon just at this stage of the affair, which was understood by all to be a divine judgment upon Laocoon for his sacrilegious temerity in striking his spear into the horse's side. It had been determined to offer a sacrifice to Neptune. Lots were drawn to determine who should perform the rite. The lot fell upon Laocoon. He began to make preparations to perform the duty, assisted by his 2 young sons, when suddenly 2 immense serpents appeared, coming up from the sea. They came swimming over the surface of the water, with their heads elevated above the waves, until they reached the shore, and then, gliding swiftly along, they advanced across the plain, their bodies brilliantly spotted and glittering in the sun, their eyes flashing, and their forked and venomous tongues darting threats and defiance as they came. The people fled in dismay. The serpents, disregarding all others, made their way directly toward the affrighted children of Laocoon. Entwining around them, they soon held the writhing and struggling limbs of their shrieking victims hopelessly entangled in their deadly convulsions. Laocoon, who was himself at a little distance from the spot when the serpents came, as soon as he saw the danger and heard the agonizing cries of his boys, seized a weapon and ran to rescue them. Instead, however, of being able to save his children, he only involved himself in their dreadful fate. The serpents seized him as soon as he came within their reach, and taking 2 turns around his neck and 2 around his body, and binding in a remorseless grip the forms of the fainting and dying boys with other convolutions, they raised their heads high above the group of victims which they thus enfolded, and hissed and darted out their forked tongues in token of defiance and victory. When at length their work was done, they glided away and took refuge in a temple that was near, and coiled themselves up for repose beneath the feet of the statue of a goddess that stood in the shrine. The story of Laocoon has become celebrated among all mankind in modern times by means of a statue representing the catastrophe which was found 2 or 3 centuries ago among the ruins of an ancient edifice at Rome. This statue was mentioned by an old Roman writer, Pliny, who gave an account of it while it yet stood in its place in the ancient city. He said that it was the work of 3 artists, a father and 2 sons, who combined their industry and skill to carve in one group, and with immense labor and care, the representation of Laocoon himself, the 2 boys, and the 2 serpents, making 5 living bodies intertwined intricately together, and all carved from one single block of marble. On the decline and fall of Rome, this statue was lost among the ruins of the city, and for many centuries it was known to mankind only through the description of Pliny. At length it was brought to light again, having been discovered about 3 centuries ago under the ruins of the very edifice in which Pliny had described it as standing. It immediately became the object of great interest and attention to the whole world. It was deposited in the Vatican. A great reward was paid to the owner of the ground on which it was discovered. Drawings and casts of it without number have been made, and the original stands in the Vatican now, an object of universal interest, as one of the most celebrated sculptures of ancient or modern times. Laocoon himself forms the center of the group, with the serpents twined around him, while he struggles with a fearful expression of terror and anguish in his countenance. In the vain attempt to release himself from their hold, one of the serpents has bitten one of the boys in the side, and the wounded child sinks under the effects of the poison. The other boy, in an agony of terror, is struggling hopelessly to release his foot from the convolutions with which one of the serpents has encircled it. The expression of the whole group is exciting and painful, and yet, notwithstanding this, there is combined with it a certain mysterious grace and beauty which charms every eye and makes the composition the wonder of mankind. But to return to the story. The people understood this awful visitation to be the judgment of heaven against Laocoon for his sacrilegious presumption in daring to thrust his spear into the side of the image before them, and which they were now very sure they were to consider as something supernatural and divine. They determined with one accord to take it into the city. They immediately began to make preparations for the transportation of it. They raised it from the ground and fitted it to the feet some sort of machinery of wheels or rollers suitable to the nature of the ground and strong enough to bear the weight of the colossal mass. They attached long ropes to the neck of the image and extended them forward upon the ground, and then brought up large companies of citizens and soldiers to man them. They arranged a procession consisting of the generals of the army and of the great civil dignitaries of the state, and in addition to these were groups of singing boys and girls, adorned with wreaths and garlands, who were appointed to chant sacred hymns to solemnize the occasion. They widened the access to the city, too, by tearing down a portion of the wall, so as to open a sufficient space to enable the monster to get in. When all was ready, the ropes were manned, the signal was given, the ponderous mass began to move, and though it encountered in its progress many difficulties, obstructions, and delays, in due time it was safely deposited in the court of a great public edifice within the city. The wall was then repaired. The day passed away. The night came on. The gates were shut, and the curiosity and wonder of the people within being gradually satisfied, they at length dispersed to their several homes and retired to rest. At midnight the unconscious effigy stood silent and alone where its worshippers had left it, while the whole population of the city were sunk in slumber, except the sentinels who had been stationed as usual to keep guard at the gates or to watch upon the towers and battlements above them. In the meantime the Greek fleet, which had sailed away under pretense of finally abandoning the country, had proceeded only to the island of Tenedos, which was about a league from the shore, and there they had concealed themselves during the day. As soon as night came on they returned to the mainland, and disembarking with the utmost silence and secrecy, they made their way back again under cover of the darkness as near as they dared to come to the gates of the city. In the meantime Sinan had arisen stealthily from the sleep which he had feigned, to deceive those to whose charge he had been committed, and creeping cautiously through the streets, he repaired to the place where the wooden horse had been deposited, and there opened a secret door in the side of the image, and liberated a band of armed and desperate men who had been concealed within. These men, as soon as they had descended to the ground and had adjusted their armor, rushed to the city walls, surprised and killed the sentinels and watchmen, threw open the gates, and gave the whole body of their comrades that were lurking outside the walls in the silence and darkness of the night an unobstructed admission. Aeneas was asleep in his house while these things were transpiring. The house where he lived was in a retired and quiet situation, but he was awakened from his sleep by distant outcries and din, and springing from his couch and hastily resuming his clothes, he ascended to the roof of the house to ascertain the cause of the alarm. He saw flames ascending from various edifices in the quarter of the city where the Greeks had come in. He listened. He could distinctly hear the shouts of men and the notes of trumpets sounding the alarm. He immediately seized his armor and rushed forth into the streets, arousing the inhabitants around him from their slumbers by his shouts, and calling upon them to arm themselves and follow him. In the midst of this excitement there suddenly appeared before him, coming from the scene of the conflict, a Trojan friend named Pantheus, who was hastening away from the danger, perfectly bewildered with excitement and agitation. He was leading with him his little son, who was likewise pale with terror. Aeneas asked Pantheus what had happened. Pantheus, in reply, explained to him in hurried and broken words that armed men, treacherously concealed within the wooden horse, had issued forth from their concealment and had opened the gates of the city, and let the whole horde of their ferocious and desperate enemies in; that the sentinels and guards who had been stationed at the gate had been killed, and that the Greek troops had full possession of the city, and were barricading the streets and setting fire to the buildings on every side. "All is lost," he said. "Our cause is ruined, and Troy is no more." The announcing of these tidings filled Aeneas and those who had joined him with a species of frenzy. They resolved to press forward into the combat, and there, if they must perish themselves, to carry down as many as possible of their enemies with them to destruction. They pressed on, therefore, through the gloomy streets, guiding their way toward the scene of action by the glare of the fires upon the sky, and by the sounds of the distant tumult and din. They soon found themselves in the midst of scenes of dreadful terror and confusion, the scenes, in fact, which are usually exhibited in the midnight sacking of a city. They met with various adventures during the time that they continued their desperate but hopeless resistance. They encountered a party of Greeks, and overpowered and slew them, and then, seizing the armor which their fallen enemies had worn, they disguised themselves in it, in hopes to deceive the main body of the Greeks by this means, so as to mingle among them unobserved, and thus attack and destroy such small parties as they might meet without being themselves attacked by the rest. They saw the Princess Cassandra, the young daughter of King Priam, dragged away by Greek soldiers from a temple where she had sought refuge. They immediately undertook to rescue her, and were at once attacked both by the Greek party who had the princess in charge, and also by the Trojan soldiers who shot arrows and darts down upon them from the roofs above, supposing from the armor and the plumes which they wore that they were enemies. They saw the royal palace besieged, and the torches formed from scaling the walls of it. The tumult and din, and the frightful glare of lurid flames by which the city was illuminated, formed a scene of inconceivable confusion and terror. Aeneas watched the progress of the assault upon the palace from the top of certain lofty roofs, to which he ascended for the purpose. Here there was a slender tower, which had been built for a watchtower, and had been carried up to such a height that from the summit of it the watchman stationed there could survey all the environs of the city, and on one side look off to some distance over the sea. This tower Aeneas and the Trojans who were with them contrived to cut off at its base, and throw over upon the throngs of Grecians that were thundering at the palace gates below. Great numbers were killed by the falling ruins, and the tortoise was broken down. The Greeks, however, soon formed another tortoise, by means of which some of the soldiers scaled the walls, while others broke down the gates with battering rams and engines, and thus the palace, the sacred and last remaining stronghold of the city, was thrown open to the ferocious and frantic horde of its assailants. The sacking of the palace presented an awful spectacle to the view of Aeneas and his companions as they looked down upon it from the roofs and battlements around. As the walls, one after another, fell in under the resistless blows dealt by the engines that were brought against them, the interior halls and the most retired and private apartments were thrown open to view, all illuminated by the glare of the surrounding conflagrations. Shrieks and wailing, and every other species of outcry that comes from grief, terror, and despair, arose from within, and such spectators as had the heart to look continuously upon the spectacle could see wretched men running to and fro, and virgins clinging to altars for protection, and frantic mothers vainly endeavoring to find hiding places for themselves and their helpless children. Priam the king, who was at this time old and infirm, was aroused from his slumbers by the dreadful din, and immediately began to seize his armor and to prepare himself for rushing into the fight. His wife, however, Hecuba, begged and entreated him to desist. She saw that all was lost, and that any farther attempts at resistance would only exasperate their enemies and render their own destruction the more inevitable. She persuaded the king, therefore, to give up his weapons and go with her to an altar in one of the courts of the palace, a place which it would be sacrilege for their enemies to violate, and there patiently and submissively to await the end. Priam yielded to the queen's solicitations, and went with her to the place of refuge which she had chosen, and the plan which they thus adopted might very probably have been successful in saving their lives, had it not been for an unexpected occurrence which suddenly intervened, and which led to a fatal result. While they were seated by the altar in attitudes of submission and suppliance, they were suddenly aroused by the rushing toward them of one of their sons, who came in, wounded and bleeding, from some scene of combat, and pursued by angry and ferocious foes. The spent and fainting warrior sank down at the feet of his father and mother, and lay there dying and weltering in the blood which flowed from his wounds. The aged king was aroused to madness at this spectacle. He leaped to his feet, seized a javelin, and thundering out at the same time the most loud and bitter imprecations against the murderers of his son, he hurled the weapon toward them as they advanced. The javelin struck the shield of the leader of the assailants and rebounded from it without producing any other effect than to enrage still more the furious spirit which it was meant to destroy. The assailant rushed forward, seized the aged father by the hair, dragged him, slipping as he went in the blood of his son, up to the altar, and there plunged a sword into his body, burying it to the hilt, and then threw him down, convulsed and dying, upon the body of his dying child. Thus Priam fell, and with him the last hope of the people of Troy. The city in full possession of their enemies, the palace and citadel sacked and destroyed, and the king slain. They saw that there was nothing now left for which they had any wish to contend. End of chapter 4. Recording by Sundiata.
Chapter 5 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 5. The Flight of Aeneas. B.C. 1200. Aeneas, from his station upon the battlements of a neighboring edifice, witnessed the taking of the palace and the death of Priam. He immediately gave up all for lost, and turned his thoughts at once to the sole question of the means of saving himself and his family from impending destruction. He thought of his father, Anchises, who at this time lived with him in the city, and was nearly the same age as Priam the king, whom he had just seen so cruelly slain. He thought of his wife, too, whom he had left at home, and of his little son Ascanius, and he began now to be overwhelmed with the apprehension that the besiegers had found their way to his dwelling, and were perhaps at that very moment plundering and destroying it, and perpetrating cruel deeds of violence and outrage upon his wife and family. He determined immediately to hasten home. He looked around to see who of his companions remained with him. There was not one. They had all gone and left him alone. Some had leaped down from the battlements and made their escape to other parts of the city. Some had fallen in the attempt to leap, and had perished in the flames that were burning among the buildings beneath them. Others still had been reached by darts and arrows from below, and had tumbled headlong from their lofty height into the street beneath them. The Greeks, too, had left that part of the city. When the destruction of the palace had been effected, there was no longer any motive to remain, and they had gone away, one band after another, with loud shouts of exultation and defiance, to seek new combats in other quarters of the city. Aeneas listened to the sounds of their voices as they gradually died away upon his ear. Thus, in one way and another, all had gone, and Aeneas found himself alone. Aeneas contrived to find his way back safely to the street, and then, stealthily choosing his way, and vigilantly watching against the dangers that surrounded him, he advanced cautiously among the ruins of the palace in the direction toward his own home. He had not proceeded far before he saw a female figure lurking in the shadow of an altar near which he had to pass. It proved to be the Princess Helen. Helen was a Grecian princess formerly the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, but she had eloped from Greece some years before with Paris, the son of Priam, king of Troy, and this elopement had been the whole cause of the Trojan War. In the first instance, Menelaus, accompanied by another Grecian chieftain, went to Troy and demanded that Helen should be given up again to her proper husband. Paris refused to surrender her. Menelaus then returned to Greece and organized a grand expedition to proceed to Troy and recapture the queen. This was the origin of the war. The people therefore looked upon Helen as the cause, whether innocent or guilty, of all their calamities. When Aeneas, therefore, who was, as may well be supposed, in no very amiable or gentle temper, as he hurried along away from the smoking ruins of the palace toward his home, saw Helen endeavoring to screen herself from the destruction which she had been the means of bringing upon all that he held dear, he was aroused to a frenzy of anger against her, and determined to avenge the wrongs of his country by her destruction. "I will kill her," said he to himself, as he rushed forward toward the spot where she was concealed. "There is no great glory, it is true, in wreaking vengeance on a woman, or in bringing her to the punishment which her crimes deserve. Still, I will kill her, and I shall be commended for the deed. She shall not, after bringing ruin upon us, escape herself, and go back to Greece in safety, and be a queen there again." As Aeneas said these words, rushing forward at the same time, sword in hand, he was suddenly intercepted and brought to a stand by the apparition of his mother, the goddess Aphrodite, who all at once stood in the way before him. She stopped him, took him by the hand, urged him to restrain his useless anger, and calmed and quieted him with soothing words. "It is not Helen," said she, "that has caused the destruction of Troy. It is through the irresistible and irrevocable decrees of the gods that the city has fallen. It is useless for you to struggle against inevitable destiny, or to attempt to take vengeance on mere human means and instrumentalities. Think no more of Helen. Think of your family. Your aged father, your helpless wife, your little son, where are they? Even now, while you are wasting time here in vain attempts to take vengeance on Helen for what the gods have done, all that are near and dear to you are surrounded by ferocious enemies thirsting for their blood. Fly to them and save them. I shall accompany you, though unseen, and will protect you and them from every impending danger." As soon as Aphrodite had spoken these words, she disappeared from view. Aeneas, following her injunctions, went directly toward his home, and he found as he passed along the streets that the way was opened for him by mysterious movements among the armed bands which were passing in every direction about the city, in such a manner as to convince him that his mother was really accompanying him and protecting his way by her supernatural powers. When he reached home, the first person whom he saw was Anchises, his father. He told Anchises that all was lost, and that nothing now remained for them but to seek safety for themselves by flying to the mountains behind the city. But Anchises refused to go. "You, who are young," said he, "and who have enough of life before you to be worth preserving, may fly. As for me, I will not attempt to save the little remnant that remains to me, to be spent, if saved, in miserable exile. If the powers of heaven had intended that I should have lived any longer, they would have spared my native city, my only home. You may go yourselves, but leave me here to die." In saying these words, Anchises turned away in great despondency, firmly fixed, apparently, in his determination to remain and share the fate of the city. Aeneas and Creusa, his wife, joined their entreaties in urging him to go away, but he would not be persuaded. Aeneas then declared that he would not go and leave his father. If one was to die, they would all die, he said, together. He called for his armor and began to put it on, resolving to go out again into the streets of the city and die, since he must die, in the act of destroying his destroyers. He was, however, prevented from carrying this determination into effect by Creusa's intervention, who fell down before him at the threshold of the door, almost frantic with excitement and terror, and holding her little son Ascanius with one arm, and clasping her husband's knees with the other, she begged him not to leave them. "Stay and save us," said she. "Do not go and throw your life away. Or if you will go, take us with you, that we may all die together." The conflict of impulses and passions in this unhappy family continued for some time longer, but it ended at last in the yielding of Anchises to the wishes of the rest, and they all resolved to fly. In the meantime the noise and uproar in the streets of the city were drawing nearer and nearer, and the light of the burning buildings breaking out continually at new points in the progress of the conflagration indicated that no time was to be lost. Aeneas hastily formed his plan. His father was too old and infirm to go himself through the city. Aeneas determined, therefore, to carry him upon his shoulders. Little Ascanius was to walk along by his side. Creusa was to follow, keeping as close as possible to her husband, lest she should lose him in the darkness of the night, or in the scenes of uproar and confusion through which they would have to pass on the way. The domestics of the family were to escape from the city by different routes, each choosing his own, in order to avoid attracting the attention of their enemies, and when once without the gates, they were all to rendezvous again at a certain rising ground, not far from the city, which Aeneas designated to them by means of an old deserted temple which marked the spot, and a venerable cypress which grew there. This plan being formed, the party immediately proceeded to put it in execution. Aeneas spread a lion's skin over his shoulders to make the resting place more easy for his father, or perhaps to lighten the pressure of the heavy burden upon his own limbs. Anchises took what were called the household gods in his hands. These were sacred images which it was customary to keep in those days in every dwelling, as the symbol and embodiment of divine protection. To save these images when everything else was given up for lost was always the object of the last desperate effort of the husband and father. Aeneas in this case asked his father to take these images, as it would have been an impiety for him, having come fresh from scenes of battle and bloodshed, to have put his hand upon them without previously performing some ceremony of purification. Ascanius took hold of his father's hand. Creusa followed behind. Thus arranged, they sallied forth from the house into the streets, all dark and gloomy, except so far as they received a partial and inconstant light from the flames of the distant conflagrations, which glared in the sky and flashed sometimes upon battlements and towers, and upon the tops of lofty dwellings. Aeneas pressed steadily on, though in a state continually of the highest excitement and apprehension. He kept stealthily along wherever he could find the deepest shadows, under walls, and through the most obscure and the narrowest streets. He was in constant fear lest some stray dart or arrow should strike Anchises or Creusa, or lest some band of Greeks should come suddenly upon them, in which case he knew well that they would all be cut down without mercy, for, loaded down as he was with his burden, he would be entirely unable to do anything to defend either himself or them. The party, however, for a time, seemed to escape all these dangers, but at length, just as they were approaching the gate of the city, and began to think that they were safe, they were suddenly alarmed by a loud uproar, and by a rush of men which came in toward them from some streets in that quarter of the city, and threatened to overwhelm them. Anchises was greatly alarmed. He saw the gleaming weapons of the Greeks who were rushing toward them, and he called out to Aeneas to fly faster, or to turn off some other way, in order to escape the impending danger. Aeneas was terrified by the shouts and uproar which he heard, and his mind was for a moment confused by the bewildering influences of the scene. He, however, hurried forward, running this way and that, wherever there seemed the best prospect of escape, and often embarrassed and retarded in his flight by the crowds of people who were moving confusedly in all directions. At length, however, he succeeded in finding egress from the city. He pressed on without stopping to look behind him, till he reached the appointed place of rendezvous on the hill, and then, gently laying down his burden, he looked around for Creusa. She was nowhere to be seen. Aeneas was in utter consternation at finding that his wife was gone. He mourned and lamented this dreadful calamity with loud exclamations of grief and despair. Then, reflecting that it was a time for action, and not for idle grief, he hastened to conceal his father and Ascanius in a dark and winding valley behind the hill, and leaving them there under the charge of his domestics, he hastened back to the city to see if Creusa could be found. He armed himself completely before he went, being in his desperation determined to encounter every danger in his attempts to find and to recover his beloved wife. He went directly to the gate from which he had come out, and re-entering the city there, he began to retrace as well as he could the way that he had taken in coming out of the city, guiding himself as he went by the light of the flames which rose up here and there from the burning buildings. He went on in this way, in a desperate state of agitation and distress, searching everywhere, but seeing nothing of Creusa. At length he thought it possible that she had concluded, when she found herself separated from him, to go back to the house as the safest place of refuge for her, and he determined, accordingly, to go and seek her there. This was his last hope, and most cruelly was it disappointed when he came to the place of his dwelling. He found his house, when he arrived near the spot, all in flames. The surrounding buildings were burning too, and the streets in the neighbourhood were piled up with furniture and goods which the wretched inmates of the dwellings had vainly endeavoured to save. These inmates themselves were standing around, distracted with grief and terror, and gazing hopelessly upon the scene of devastation before them. Aeneas saw all of these things at a glance, and immediately, in a frenzy of excitement, began to call out Creusa's name. He went to and fro among the groups surrounding the fire, calling for her in a frantic manner, and imploring all whom he saw to give him some tidings of her. All was, however, in vain. She could not be found. Aeneas then went roaming about through other portions of the city, seeking her everywhere, and inquiring for her of every person whom he met that had the appearance of being a friend. His suspense, however, was terminated at last by his suddenly coming upon an apparition of the spirit of Creusa, which rose before him in a solitary part of the city and arrested his progress. The apparition was of preternatural size, and it stood before him in so ethereal and shadow-like a form, and the features beamed upon him with so calm and placid and benignant an expression, as convinced him that the vision was not of this world. Aeneas saw at a glance that Creusa's earthly sorrows and sufferings were ended for ever. At first he was shocked and terrified at the spectacle. Creusa, however, endeavoured to calm and quiet him by soothing words. "My dearest husband," said she, "do not give way thus to anxiety and grief. The events which have befallen us have not come by chance. They are all ordered by an overruling Providence that is omnipotent and divine. It was predetermined by the decrees of heaven that you were not to take me with you in your flight. I have learned what your future destiny is to be. There is a long period of weary wandering before you, over the ocean and on the land, and you will have many difficulties, dangers, and trials to incur. You will, however, be conducted safely through them all, and will, in the end, find a peaceful and happy home on the banks of the Tiber. There you will found a new kingdom. A princess is even now provided for you there, to become your bride. Cease, then, to mourn for me. Rather rejoice that I did not fall a captive into the hands of our enemies, to be carried away into Greece and made a slave. I am free, and you must not lament my fate. Farewell. Love Ascanius for my sake, and watch over him, and protect him as long as you live." Having spoken these words, the vision began to disappear. Aeneas endeavoured to clasp the beloved image in his arms to retain it, but it was intangible and evanescent, and before he could speak to it, it was gone, and he was left standing in the desolate and gloomy street alone. He turned at length slowly away, and solitary, thoughtful, and sad, he went back to the gate of the city, and thence out to the valley where he had concealed Anchises and his little son. He found them safe. The whole party then sought places of retreat among the glens and mountains where they could remain concealed a few days, while Aeneas and his companions could make arrangements for abandoning the country altogether. These arrangements were soon completed. As soon as the Greeks had retired, so that they could come out without danger from their place of retreat, Aeneas employed his men in building a number of small vessels, fitting them, as was usual in those days, both with sails and oars. During the progress of these preparations, small parties of Trojans were coming in continually, day by day, to join him, being drawn successively from their hiding places among the mountains by hearing that the Greeks had gone away, and that Aeneas was gradually assembling the remnant of the Trojans on the shore. The numbers thus collected at Aeneas's encampment gradually increased, and as Aeneas enlarged and extended his naval preparations to correspond with the augmenting numbers of his adherents, he found when he was ready to set sail that he was at the head of a very respectable naval and military force. When the fleet at last was ready, he put a stock of provisions on board, and embarked his men, taking, of course, Anchises and Ascanius with him. As soon as a favourable wind arose, the expedition set sail. As the vessels moved slowly away, the decks were covered with men and women, who gazed mournfully at the receding shores, conscious that they were bidding a final farewell to their native land. The nearest country within reach, in leaving the Trojan coast, was Thrace, a country lying north of the Aegean Sea, and of the Propontis, being separated, in fact, in one part from the Trojan territories only by the Hellespont. Aeneas turned his course northward toward this country, and after a short voyage landed there and attempted to make a settlement. He was, however, prevented from remaining long by a dreadful prodigy which he witnessed there, and which induced him to leave those shores very precipitously. The prodigy was this. They had erected an altar on the shore after they landed, and were preparing to offer the sacrifices customary on such occasions, when Aeneas, wishing to shade the altar with boughs, went to a myrtle bush which was growing near, and began to pull up the green shoots from the ground. To his astonishment and horror, he found that blood flowed from the roots whenever they were broken. Drops of what appeared to be human blood would ooze from the ruptured part as he held the shoot in his hand, and fall slowly to the ground. He was greatly terrified at this spectacle, considering it as some omen of very dreadful import. He immediately and instinctively offered up a prayer to the presiding deities of the land, that they would avert from him the evil influences, whatever they might be, which the omen seemed to portend, or that they would at least explain the meaning of the prodigy. After offering this prayer, he took hold of another stem of the myrtle, and attempted to draw it from the ground, in order to see whether any change in the appearances exhibited by the prodigy had been effected by his prayer. At the instant, however, when the roots began to give way, he heard a groan coming up from the ground below, as if from a person in suffering. Immediately afterward a voice in a mournful and sepulchral accent began to beg him to go away, and cease disturbing the repose of the dead. "What you are tearing and lacerating," said the voice, "is not a tree, but a man. I am Polydorus. I was killed by the king of Thrace, and instead of burial have been turned into a myrtle growing on the shore." Polydorus was a Trojan prince. He was the youngest son of Priam, and had been sent some years before to Thrace to be brought up in the court of the Thracian king. He had been provided with a large sum of money and treasure when he left Troy, in order that all his wants might be abundantly supplied, and that he might maintain during his absence from home the position to which his rank as a Trojan prince entitled him. His treasures, however, which had been provided for him by his father as his sure reliance for support and protection, became the occasion of his ruin, for the Thracian king, when he found that the war was going against the Trojans, and that Priam the father was slain and the city destroyed, murdered the helpless son to get possession of his gold. Aeneas and his companions were shocked to hear this story, and perceived at once that Thrace was no place of safety for them. They resolved immediately to leave the coast and seek their fortunes in other regions. They, however, first in secrecy and silence, but with great solemnity, performed those funeral rites for Polydorus which were considered in those ages essential to the repose of the dead. When these mournful ceremonies were ended, they embarked on board their ships again and sailed away. After this, the party of Aeneas spent many months in weary voyages from island to island, and from shore to shore, along the Mediterranean Sea, encountering every imaginable difficulty and danger, and meeting continually with the strangest and most romantic adventures. At one time they were misled by a mistaken interpretation of a prophecy to attempt a settlement in Crete, a green and beautiful island lying south of the Aegean Sea. They had applied to a sacred oracle, which had its seat at a certain consecrated spot which they visited in the course of their progress southward through the Aegean Sea, asking the oracle to direct them where to go in order to find a settled home. The oracle, in answer to their request, informed them that they were to go to the land that their ancestors had originally come from before their settlement in Troy. Aeneas applied to Anchises to inform them what land this was. Anchises replied that he thought it was Crete. There was an ancient tradition, he said, that some distinguished men among the ancestors of the Trojans had originated in Crete, and he presumed, accordingly, that that was the land to which the oracle referred. The course of the little fleet was accordingly directed southward, and in due time the expedition safely reached the island of Crete, and landed there. They immediately commenced the work of effecting a settlement. They drew the ships up upon the shore, they laid out a city, they enclosed and planted fields, and began to build their houses. In a short time, however, all their bright prospects of rest and security were blighted by the breaking out of a dreadful pestilence among them. Many died, others who still lived were utterly prostrated by the effects of the disease, and crawled about, emaciated and wretched, a miserable and piteous spectacle to behold. To crown their misfortunes, a great drought came on. The grain which they had planted was dried up and killed in the fields, and thus, in addition to the horrors of pestilence, they were threatened with the still greater horrors of famine. Their distress was extreme, and they were utterly at a loss to know what to do. In this extremity Anchises recommended that they should send back to the oracle to inquire more particularly in respect to the meaning of the former response, in order to ascertain whether they had by possibility misinterpreted it, and made their settlement on the wrong ground; or, if this was not the case, to learn by what other error or fault they had displeased the celestial powers, and brought upon themselves such terrible judgments. Aeneas determined to adopt this advice, but he was prevented from carrying his intentions into effect by the following occurrence. One night he was lying upon his couch in his dwelling, so harassed by his anxieties and cares that he could not sleep, and revolving in his mind all possible plans for extricating himself and his followers from the difficulties which environed them. The moon shone in at all the windows, and by the light of this luminary he saw, reposing in their shrines in the opposite side of the apartment where he was sleeping, the household images which he had rescued from the flames of Troy. As he looked upon these divinities, in the still and solemn hour of midnight, oppressed with anxiety and care, one of them began to address him. "We are commissioned," said this supernatural voice, by Apollo, whose oracle you are intending to consult again, to give you the answer that you desire, without requiring you to go back to his temple. It is true that you have erred in attempting to make a settlement in Crete. This is not the land which is destined to be your home. You must leave these shores and continue your voyage. The land which is destined to receive you is Italy, a land far removed from this spot, and your way to it lies over wide and boisterous seas. Do not be discouraged, however, on this account, or on account of the calamities which now impend over you. You will be prospered in the end. You will reach Italy in safety, and there you will lay the foundations of a mighty empire, which in days to come will extend its dominion far and wide among the nations of the earth. Take courage, then, and embark once more in your ships with a cheerful and confident heart. You are safe, and in the end all will turn out well." The strength and spirits of the desponding adventurer were very essentially revived by this encouragement. He immediately prepared to obey the injunctions which had been thus divinely communicated to him, and in a short time the half-built city was abandoned, and the expedition once more embarked on board the fleet and proceeded to sea. They met in their subsequent wanderings with a great variety of adventures, but it would extend this portion of our narrative too far to relate them all. They encountered a storm, by which for 3 days and 3 nights they were tossed to and fro, without seeing sun or stars, and of course without any guidance whatever, and during all this time they were in the most imminent danger of being overwhelmed and destroyed by the billows which rolled sublimely and frightfully around them. At another time, having landed for rest and refreshment among a group of Grecian islands, they were attacked by the Harpies, birds of prey of prodigious size and most offensive habits, and fierce and voracious beyond description. The Harpies were celebrated, in fact, in many of the ancient tales, as a race of beings that infested certain shores, and often teased and tormented the mariners and adventurers that happened to come among them. Some said, however, that there was not a race of such beings, but only 2 or 3 in all, and they gave their names. And yet different narrators gave different names, among which were Elopos, Nicothoe, Osithoe, Osipoe, Keleno, Acoloe, and Aelo. Some said that the Harpies had the faces and forms of women, others described them as frightfully ugly, but all agree in representing them as voracious beyond description, always greedily devouring everything that they could get within reach of their claws. These fierce monsters flew down upon Aeneas and his party, and carried away the food from off the table before them, and even attacked the men themselves. The men then armed themselves with swords secretly, and waited for the next approach of the Harpies, intending to kill them when they came near. But the nimble marauders eluded all their blows, and escaped with their plunder as before. At length the expedition was driven away from the island altogether by these ravenous fowls, and when they were embarking on board of their vessels, the leader of the Harpies perched herself upon a rock overlooking the scene, and in a human voice loaded Aeneas and his companions as they went away with taunts and execrations. The expedition passed one night in a great terror and dread in the vicinity of Mount Etna, where they had landed. The awful eruptions of smoke and flame and burning lava which issued at midnight from the summit of the mountain, the thundering sounds which they heard rolling beneath them through the ground, and the dread which was inspired in their minds by the terrible monsters that dwelt beneath the mountains, as they supposed, and fed the fires, all combined to impress them with a sense of unutterable awe, and as soon as the light of the morning enabled them to resume their course, they made all haste to get away from so appalling a scene. At another time they touched upon a coast which was inhabited by a race of one-eyed giants, monsters of enormous magnitude and of remorseless cruelty. They were cannibals, feeding on the bodies of men whom they killed by grasping them in their hands and beating them against the rocks which formed the sides of their den. Some men whom one of these monsters, named Polyphemus, had shut up in his cavern, contrived to surprise their keeper in his sleep, and though they were wholly unable to kill him, on account of his colossal magnitude, they succeeded in putting out his eye, and Aeneas and his companions saw the blinded giant, as they passed along the coast, wading in the sea and bathing his wound. He was guiding his footsteps as he walked by means of the trunk of a tall pine which served him for a staff. At length, however, after the lapse of a long period of time, and after meeting with a great variety of adventures to which we cannot even here allude, Aeneas and his party reached the shores of Italy, at the point which by divine intimations had been pointed out to them as the place where they were to land. The story of the life and adventures of Aeneas, which we have given in this and in the preceding chapters, is a faithful summary of the narrative which the poetic historians of those days recorded. It is, of course, not to be relied upon as a narrative of facts, but it is worthy of very special attention by every cultivated mind of the present day, from the fact that such is the beauty, the grace, the melody, the inimitable poetic perfection with which the story is told, in the language in which the original record stands, that the narrative has made a more deep and wide-spread and lasting impression on the human mind than any other narrative, perhaps, that ever was penned. Chapter 6.
Chapter 6 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 6. B.C. 1197 to 1190. Latium was the name given to an ancient province in Italy lying south of the Tiber. At the time of Aeneas's arrival upon the coast, it was an independent kingdom. The name of the king who reigned over it at this period was Latinus. The country on the banks of the Tiber, where the city of Rome afterward arose, was then a wild but picturesque royal region, consisting of hills and valleys occupied by shepherds and herdsmen, but with nothing upon it whatever to mark it as the site of a city. The people that dwelt at Latium were shepherds and herdsmen, though there was a considerable band of warriors under the command of the king. The inhabitants of the country were of Greek origin, and they had brought with them from Greece, when they colonized the country, some rude arts as were then known. They had the use of Cadmus's letters for writing. So far as writing was employed at all in those early days, they were skillful in making such weapons of war and such simple instruments of music as were known at the time, and they could erect buildings of wood or of stone, and thus constructed such dwellings as they needed in their towns, and walls and citadels for defense. Aeneas brought his fleet into the mouth of the Tiber and anchored it there. He himself and all his followers were thoroughly weary of their wanderings, and hoped that they were now about to land where they would find a permanent abode. The number of ships and men that had formed the expedition at the commencement of the voyage was very large, but it had been considerably diminished by the various misfortunes and accidents incident to such an enterprise, and the remnant that was left longed ardently for rest. Some of the ships took fire and were burned at their moorings in the Tiber. Immediately after the arrival of the expedition, it was said that they were set on fire by the wives and mothers belonging to the expedition, who wished by destroying the ships to render it impossible for the fleet to go to sea again. However this may be, Aeneas was very strongly disposed to make the beautiful region which he now saw before him his final home. The country, in every aspect of it, was alluring in the highest degree. Level plains, varied here and there by gentle elevations, extended around him, all adorned with groves and flowers, and exhibiting a luxuriance in the verdure of the grass and in the foliage of the trees that was perfectly enchanting to the sea-weary eyes of his company of mariners. In the distance, blue and beautiful mountains bounded the horizon, and a soft, warm summer haze floated over the whole scene, bathing the landscape in a rich, mellow light peculiar to Italian skies. As soon as the disembarkment was effected, lines of encampment were marked out at a suitable place on the shore, and such simple fortifications as were necessary for defense in such a case were thrown up. Aeneas dispatched one party in boats to explore the various passages and channels which formed the mouth of the river, perhaps in order to be prepared to make good his escape again to sea in case of any sudden or extraordinary danger. Another party were employed in erecting altars and preparing for sacrifices and other religious celebrations, designed on the part of Aeneas to propitiate the deities of the place, and to inspire his men with religious confidence and trust. He also immediately proceeded to organize a party of reconnoiters who were to proceed into the interior to explore the country and to communicate with the inhabitants. The party of reconnoiters thus sent out followed up the banks of the river and made excursions in various directions across the fields and plains. They found that the country was everywhere verdant and beautiful, and that it was covered in the interior with scattered hamlets and towns. They learned the name of the king, and also that of the city which he made his capital. Latinus himself at the same time heard the tidings of the arrival of these strangers. His first impulse was immediately to make an onset upon them with all his forces and drive them away from his shores. On farther enquiry, however, he learned that they were in a distressed and suffering condition, and from the descriptions which were given him of their dress and demeanor, he concluded that they were Greeks. This idea awakened in his mind some apprehension, for the Greeks were then well known throughout the world and were regarded everywhere as terrible enemies. Besides his fears, his pity and compassion were awakened too. In some degree he was, on the whole, for a time, quite at a loss to know what course to pursue in respect to the intruders. In the meantime, Aeneas concluded to send an embassy to Latinus to explain the circumstances under which he had been induced to land so large a party on the Italian coast. He accordingly designated a considerable number of men to form this embassy, and giving to some of the number his instructions as to what they were to say to Latinus, he committed to the hands of the others a large number of gifts which they were to carry and present to him. These gifts consisted of weapons, elaborately finished vessels of gold or silver, embroidered garments, and such other articles as were customarily employed in those days as propitiatory offerings in such emergencies. The embassy, when all was arranged, proceeded to the Latin capital. When they came in sight of it, they found that it was a spacious city, with walls around it, and turrets and battlements within, rising here and there above the roofs of the dwellings. Outside the gates a portion of the population were assembled, busily engaged in games and in various gymnastic and equestrian performances. Some were driving furiously in chariots around great circles marked out for the course. Others were practicing feats of horsemanship, or running races upon fleet chargers. Others still were practicing with darts, or bows and arrows, or javelins, either to test and improve their individual skill, or else to compete with each other for victory or for a prize. The ambassadors paused when they came in view of this scene, and waited until intelligence could be sent in to the monarch informing him of their arrival. Latinus decided immediately to admit the embassy to an audience, and they were accordingly conducted into the city. They were led, after entering by the gates, through various streets, until they came at length to a large public edifice, which seemed to be at the same time palace, senate house, and citadel. There were to be seen in the avenues which led to this edifice statues of old warriors and various other martial decorations. There were many old trophies of former victories preserved here, such as arms and chariots and prows of ships and crests and great bolts and bars taken from the gates of conquered cities, all old, war-worn, and now useless, but preserved as memorials of bravery and conquest. The Trojan embassy, passing through and among these trophies as they stood or hung in the halls and vestibules of the palace, were at length ushered into the presence of Latinus the king. Here, after the usual ceremonies of introduction were performed, they delivered the message which Aeneas had entrusted to them. They declared that they had not landed in Latinus's shore with any hostile intent. They had been driven away, they said, from their own homes by a series of dire calamities which had ended at last in the total destruction of their native city. Since then they had been driven to and fro at the mercy of the winds and waves, exposed to every conceivable degree of hardship and danger. Their landing finally in the dominions of Latinus in Italy was not, they confessed, wholly undesigned, for Latinum had been divinely indicated to them on their way as the place destined by the decrees of heaven for their final home. Following these indications, they had sought the shores of Italy and the mouths of the Tiber, and having succeeded in reaching them, had landed. And now Aeneas, their commander, desired of the king that he would allow them to settle in his land in peace, and that he would set apart a portion of his territory for them, and give them leave to build a city. The effect produced upon the mind of Latinus by the appearance of these ambassadors, and by the communication which they had to him, proved to be highly favorable. He received the presents, too, which they had brought him, in a very gracious manner, and appeared to be much pleased with them. He had heard, as would seem, rumors of the destruction of Troy, and of the departure of Aeneas's squadron. For a long time had been consumed by the wanderings of the expedition along the Mediterranean shores, so that some years had now elapsed since the destruction of Troy and the first sailing of the fleet. In a word, Latinus soon determined to accede to the proposals of his visitors, and he concluded with Aeneas a treaty of alliance and friendship. He designated a spot where the new city might be built, and all things were thus amicably settled. There was one circumstance which exerted a powerful influence in promoting the establishment of friendly relations between Latinus and the Trojans, and that was that Latinus was engaged at the time of Aeneas's arrival in a war with the Rutulians, a nation that inhabited a country lying south of Latium and on the coast. Latinus thought that by making the Trojans his friends he should be able to enlist them as his auxiliaries in this war. Aeneas had no objection to this, and it was accordingly agreed that the Trojans, in return for being received as friends and allowed to settle in Latium, were to join with their protectors in defending the country, and were especially to aid them in prosecuting the existing war. In a short time a still closer alliance was formed between Aeneas and Latinus, an alliance which in the end resulted in the accession of Aeneas to the throne of Latinus. Latinus had a daughter named Lavinia. She was an only child, and was a princess of extraordinary merit and beauty. The name of the queen, her mother, the wife of Latinus, was Amata. Amata had intended her daughter to be the wife of Turnus, a young prince of great character and promise, who had been brought up in Latinus's court. Turnus was in fact a distant relative of Amata, and the plan of the queen was that he should marry Lavinia, and in the end succeed with her to the throne of Latinus. Latinus himself had not entered into this scheme, and when closing his negotiations with Aeneas, it seemed to him that it would be well to seal and secure the adherence of Aeneas to his cause by offering him his daughter Lavinia for his bride. Aeneas was very willing to accede to this proposal. What the wishes of Lavinia herself were in respect to the arrangement, it is not very well known, nor were her wishes, according to the ideas that prevailed in those times, of any consequence whatever. The plan was arranged, and the nuptials were soon to be celebrated. Turnus, when he found that he was to be superseded, left the court of Latinus and went away out of the country in a rage. Aeneas and his followers seemed now to have come to the end of all their troubles. They were at last happily established in a fruitful land, surrounded by powerful friends, and about to enter apparently upon a long career of peaceful and prosperous industry. They immediately engaged with a great ardor in the work of building their town. Aeneas had intended to have named it Troy, in commemoration of the ancient city, now no more. But in view of his approaching marriage with Lavinia, he determined to change this design, and in honor of her he named the new capital Lavinium. The territory which had been assigned to the Trojans by Latinus was in the southwestern part of Latium, near the coast, and of course it was on the confines of the country of the Rutulians. Turnus, when he left Latium, went over to the Rutulians, determining in his resentment against Latinus for having given Lavinia to his rival to join them in the war. The Rutulians made him their leader, and he soon advanced at the head of a great army across the frontier toward the new city of Lavinium. Thus Aeneas found himself threatened with a very formidable danger. Nor was this all, for just before the commencement of the war with Turnus, an extraordinary train of circumstances occurred, which resulted in alienating the Latins themselves from their new ally, and in leaving Aeneas consequently to sustain the shock of the contest with Turnus and his Rutulians alone. It would naturally be supposed that the alliance between Latinus and Aeneas would not be very favorably regarded by the common people of Latium. They would, on the other hand, naturally look with much jealousy and distrust on a company of foreign intruders, admitted by what they would be very likely to consider the capricious partiality of their king to a share of their country. This jealousy and distrust was, for a time, suppressed and concealed, but the animosity only acquired strength and concentration by being restrained, and at length an event occurred which caused it to break forth with uncontrollable fury. The circumstances were these. There was a man in Latium named Tiresias, who held the office of royal herdsman. He lived in his hut on some of the domains of Latinus, and had charge of the flocks and herds belonging to the king. He had 2 sons, and likewise a daughter. The daughter's name was Sylvia. The 2 boys had one day succeeded in making prisoner of a young stag, which they found in the woods with its mother. It was extremely young when they captured it, and they brought it home as a great prize. They fed it with milk until it was old enough to take other food, and as it grew up accustomed to their hands, it was very tame and docile, and became a great favorite with all the family. Sylvia loved and played with it continually. She kept it always in trim by washing it in a fountain, and combing and smoothing its hair, and she amused herself by adorning it with wreaths and garlands, and such other decorations as her sylvan resources could command. One day, when Ascanius, Aeneas's son, who had now grown to be a young man, and who seemed to have been characterized by a full share of ardent and impulsive energy belonging to his years, was returning from the chase, he happened to pass by the place where the herdsman lived. Ascanius was followed by his dogs, and he had his bow and arrows in his hand. As he was thus passing along a copse of wood near a brook, the dogs came suddenly upon Sylvia's stag. The confiding animal, unconscious of any danger, had strayed away from the herdsman's ground to this grove, and had gone down to the brook to drink. The dogs immediately sprang upon him in full cry. Ascanius followed, drawing at the same time an arrow from his quiver, and fitting it to the bow. As soon as he came in sight of the stag, he let fly his arrow. The arrow pierced the poor fugitive in the side, and inflicted a dreadful wound. It did not, however, bring him down. The stag bounded on down the valley toward his home, as if to seek protection from Sylvia. He came rushing into the house, marking his way with blood, ran to the covert where Sylvia had provided for his resting place at night, and crouching down there he filled the earth dwelling with piteous bleatings and cries. As soon as Tyreus, the father of Sylvia, and the two young men, her brothers, knew who it was that had thus wantonly wounded their favorite, they were filled with indignation and rage. They went out and aroused the neighboring peasantry, who very easily caught the spirit of resentment and revenge which burned in the bosoms of Tyreus and his sons. They armed themselves with clubs, firebrands, scythes, and such other rustic weapons as came to hand, and rushed forth, resolved to punish the overbearing insolence of their foreign visitors in the most summary manner. In the meantime the Trojan youth, having heard the tidings of this disturbance, began to gather hastily, but in great numbers, to defend Ascanius. The parties on both sides were headstrong and highly excited, and before any of the older and more considerate chieftains could interfere, a very serious conflict ensued. One of the sons of Tyreus was killed. He was pierced in the throat by an arrow, and fell and died immediately. His name was Almon. He was but a boy, or at all events had not yet arrived at years of maturity, and his premature and sudden death added greatly to the prevailing excitement. Another man, too, was killed. At length the conflict was brought to an end for the time, but the excitement and the exasperation of the peasantry were extreme. They carried the two dead bodies in procession to the Capitol to exhibit them to Latinus, and they demanded in the most earnest and determined manner that he should immediately make war upon the whole Trojan horde, and drive them back into the sea whence they came. Latinus found it extremely difficult to withstand this torrent. He remained firm for a time, and made every exertion in his power to quell the excitement and to pacify the minds of his people. But all was in vain. Public sentiment turned hopelessly against the Trojans, and Aeneas soon found himself shut up in his city, surrounded with enemies, and left to his fate. Turnus was the leader of these foes. He, however, did not despair. Both parties began to prepare vigorously for war. Aeneas himself went away with a few followers to some of the neighboring kingdoms to get succor from them. Neighboring states are almost always jealous of each other, and are easily induced to take part against each other when involved in foreign wars. Aeneas found several of the Italian princes who were ready to aid him, and he returned to his camp with considerable reinforcements and with promises of more. The war soon broke out, and was waged for a long time with great determination on both sides, and with varied success. Latinus, who was now somewhat advanced in life, and had thus passed beyond the period of ambition and love of glory, and who besides must have felt that the interests of his family were now indissolubly bound up in those of Aeneas and Lavinia, watched the progress of the contest with a very uneasy and anxious mind. He found that for a time at least it would be out of his power to do anything effectual to terminate the war, so he allowed it to take its course, and contented himself with waiting patiently in hopes that an occasion which would allow of his interposing with some hope of success would sooner or later come. Such an occasion did come, for after the war had been persecuted for some time, it was found that notwithstanding the disadvantages under which the Trojans labored, they were rather gaining than losing ground. There were, in fact, some advantages as well as some disadvantages in their position. They formed a compact and concentrated body. while their enemies constituted a scattered population, spreading in a more or less exposed condition over a considerable extent of country. They had neither flocks nor herds, nor any other property for their enemies to plunder, while the Rutulians and Latins had great possessions, both of treasure in the towns and of rural produce in the country, so that when the Trojans gained the victory over them in any sally or foray, they always came home laden with booty, as well as exultant in triumph and pride, while if the Latins conquered the Trojans in a battle, they had nothing but the empty honor to reward them. The Trojans, too, were hardy, enduring, and indomitable. The alternative with them was victory or destruction. Their protracted voyage and the long experience of hardships and sufferings which they had undergone had inured them to privation and toil, so that they proved to the Latins and Rutulians to be very obstinate and formidable foes. At length, as usual in such cases, indications gradually appeared that both sides began to weary of the contest. Latinus availed himself of a favorable occasion which offered to propose that ambassadors should be sent to Aeneas with terms of peace. Turnus was very much opposed to any such plan. He was earnestly desirous of continuing to persecute the war. The other Latin chieftains reproached him then with being the cause of all the calamities which they were enduring, and urged the unreasonableness on his part of desiring any longer to protract the sufferings of his unhappy country merely to gratify his own private resentment and revenge. Turnus ought not any longer to ask, they said, that others should fight in his quarrel, and they proposed that he should himself decide the question between him and Aeneas by challenging the Trojan leader to fight him in single combat. Latinus strongly disapproved of this proposal. He was weary of war and bloodshed, and wished that the conflict might wholly cease, and he urged that peace should be made with Aeneas, and that his original design of giving him Lavinia for his wife should be carried into execution. For a moment Turnus seemed to hesitate, but in looking towards Lavinia, who, with Amata her mother, was present at this consultation, he saw, or thought he saw, in the agitation which she manifested, proofs of her love for him, and indications of a wish on her part that he and not Aeneas should win her for his bride. He accordingly, without any further hesitation or delay, agreed to the proposal of the counsellor. The challenge to single combat was given and accepted, and on the appointed day the ground was marked out for the duel, and both armies were drawn up upon the field to be spectators of the fight. After the usual preparations the conflict began, but, as frequently occurs in such cases, it was not long confined to the single pair of combatants with which it commenced. Others were gradually drawn in, and the duel became in the end a general battle. Aeneas and the Trojans were victorious, and both Latinus and Turnus were slain. This ended the war. Aeneas married Lavinia, and thenceforth reigned with her over the kingdom of Latium as its rightful sovereign. Aeneas lived several years after this, and has the credit in history of having managed the affairs of the kingdom in a very wise and provident manner. He had brought with him from Troy the arts and the learning of the Greeks, and these he introduced to his people, so as greatly to improve their condition. He introduced, too, many ceremonies of religious worship which had prevailed in the countries from which he had come, or in those which he had visited in his long voyage. These ceremonies became at last so firmly established among the religious observances of the inhabitants of Latium that they descended from generation to generation, and in subsequent years exercised great influence in modeling the religious faith and worship of the Roman people. They thus continued to be practiced for many ages, and through the literature of the Romans became subsequently known and celebrated throughout the whole civilized world. At length, in a war which Aeneas was waging with the Rutulians, he was once, after a battle, reduced to great extremity of danger, and in order to escape from his pursuers he attempted to swim across a stream, and was drowned. The name of this stream was Nemesis. It flowed into the sea a little north of Lavinium. It must have been larger in former times than it is now, for travelers who visit it at the present day say that it is now only a little rivulet in which it would be almost impossible for any one to be drowned. The Trojan followers of Aeneas concealed his body, and spread the story among the people of Latium that he had been taken up to heaven. The people, accordingly, having before considered their king as the son of a goddess, now looked upon him as himself divine. They accordingly erected altars to him in Latium, and thenceforth worshipped him as a god. End of chapter 6. Recording by Simon Wainwright.
Chapter 7 of Romulus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Garvin. Romulus by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 7. Rhea Silvia, BC 800. Rhea Silvia, the mother of Romulus, was a Vestal virgin, who lived in the kingdom of Latium about 400 years after the death of Aeneas. A Vestal virgin was a sort of priestess who was required, like the nuns of modern times, to live in seclusion from the rest of the world, and devote their time wholly and without reserve to the services of religion. They were, like nuns, especially prohibited from all association and intercourse with men. Aeneas himself is said to have founded the order of Vestal Virgins, and to have instituted the rites and services which were committed to their charge. These rites and services were in honor of Vesta, who was the goddess of home. The fireside has been, in all ages and countries, the center and the symbol of home, and the worship of Vesta consisted, accordingly, of ceremonies designed to dignify and exalt the fireside in the estimation of the people. Instead of the images and altars which were used in the worship of the other deities, a representation of a fire stand was made, such as were used in the houses of those days, and upon this sacred stand a fire was kept continually burning, and various rites and ceremonies were performed in connection with it, in honor of the domestic virtues and enjoyments, of which it was the type and symbol. These fire stands, as used by the ancients, were very different from the fireplaces of modern times, which are recesses and chimneys with flues above for the passage of the smoke. The household fires of the ancients were placed in the center of the apartment, on a hearth or supporter called the focus. This hearth was made sometimes of stone or brick, and sometimes of bronze. The smoke escaped above, through openings in the roof. This would seem, according to the ideas of the present day, a very comfortless arrangement, but it must be remembered that the climate in those countries was mild, and there was accordingly but little occasion for fire, and then, besides, such were the habits of the people at this period of the world, that not only their pursuits and avocations, but far the greater portion of their pleasures, called them into the open air. Still, the fireplace was, with them as with us, the type and emblem of domestic life, and accordingly, in paying divine honours to Vesta, the goddess of home, they set up a focus, or fireplace, in their temple, instead of an altar, and in the place of sacrifices they simply kept burning upon it a perpetual fire. The priestesses who had charge of the fire were selected for this purpose when they were children. It was required that they should be from 6 to 10 years of age. When chosen, they were consecrated to the service of Vesta by the most solemn ceremonies, and as virgins were bound under awful penalties to spotless purity of life. As the perpetual fire in the temple of Vesta represented the fire of the domestic hearth, so these Vestal virgins represented the maidens by whom the domestic service of a household is performed. And the life of seclusion and celibacy, which was required of them, was the emblem of the innocence and purity which the institution of the family is expressly intended to guard. The duties of the Vestals were analogous to those of domestic maidens. They were to watch the fire, and never to allow it to go out. They were to perform various rites and ceremonies connected with the worship of Vesta, and to keep the interior of the temple and the shrines pure and clean, and the sacred vessels and utensils arranged, as in a well-ordered household. In a word, they were to be, in purity, in industry, in neatness, in order, and in patience and vigilance, the perfect impersonation of maidenly virtue as exhibited in its own proper field of duty at home. The most awful penalties were visited upon the head of any Vestal virgin who was guilty of violating her vows. There is no direct evidence what these penalties were at this early period, but in subsequent years, at Rome, where the Vestal virgins resided, the man who was guilty of enticing one of them away from her duty was publicly scourged to death in the Roman Forum. For the Vestal herself, thus led away, a cell was dug beneath the ground and vaulted over. A pit led down to this subterranean dungeon, entering it by one side. In the dungeon itself there was placed a table, a lamp, and a little food. The descent was by a ladder which passed down through the pit. The place of this terrible preparation for punishment was near one of the gates of the city, and when all was ready, the unhappy Vestal was brought forth, at the head of a great public procession, she herself being attended by her friends and relatives, all mourning and lamenting her fate by the way. The ceremony, in a word, was in all respects a funeral, except that the person who was to be buried was still alive. On arriving at the spot, the wretched criminal was conducted down the ladder, and placed upon the couch in the cell. The assistants who performed this service then returned. The ladder was drawn up, earth was drawn in until the pit was filled, and the erring girl was left to her fate, which was, when her lamp had burned out, and her food was expended, to starve by slow degrees, and die at last in darkness and despair. If we would do full justice to the ancient founders of civilization and empire, we should probably consider their enshrinement of Vesta, and the contriving of the ceremonies and observances which were instituted in honour of her, not as the setting up of an idol or false god for worship in the sense in which Christian nations worship the spiritual and eternal Jehovah, but rather as the embodiment of an idea, a principle, as the best means, in those rude ages, of attracting to it the general regard. Even in our own days, and in Christian lands, men erect a pole in honour of liberty, and surmount it with the image of a cap. And if, instead of the cap, they were to place a carved effigy of liberty above, and to assemble for periodical celebrations below, with games and music, and banners, we should not probably call them idolaters. So Christian poets write odes and invocations to peace, to disappointment, to spring, to beauty, in which they impersonate an idea or a principle, and address it in the language of adoration, as if it were a sentient being, possessing magical and mysterious powers. In the same manner, the rites and celebrations of ancient times are not necessarily all to be considered as idolatry, and denounced as inexcusably wicked and absurd. Our fathers set up an image in honour of liberty, to strengthen the influence of the love of liberty on the popular mind. It is possible that Aeneas looked upon the subject in the same light, in erecting a public fireside in honour of domestic peace and happiness, and in designated maidens to guard it with constant vigilance and with spotless purity. At all events, the institution exercised a vast and an incalculable power in impressing the minds of men, in those rude ages, with a sense of the sacredness of the domestic tie, and in keeping before their minds a high standard, in theory at least, of domestic honour and purity. We must remember that they had not then the word of God, nor any means of communicating to the minds of the people any general enlightenment and instruction. They were obliged, therefore, to resort to the next best method which their ingenuity could devise. There were a great many very extraordinary rites and ceremonies connected with the service of the Vestal altar, and many singular regulations for the conduct of it, the origin and design of which it would now be very difficult to ascertain. As has already been remarked, the virgins were chosen when very young, being, when designated to the office, not under 6 nor over 10 years of age. They were chosen by the king, and it was necessary that the candidate, besides the above-named requisite in regard to age, should be in a perfect condition of soundness and health in respect to all her bodily limbs and members, and also to the faculties of her mind. It was required, too, that she should be the daughter of free and freeborn parents, who had never been in slavery, and had never followed any menial or degrading occupation, and also that both her parents should be living. To be an orphan was considered, it seems, in some sense an imperfection. The service of the Vestal Virgins continued for 30 years, and when this period had expired, the maidens were discharged from their vows, and were allowed, if they chose, to lay aside their vestal robes, and the other emblems of their office, and return to the world, with the privilege even of marrying if they chose to do so. Though the laws, however, permitted this, there was a public sentiment against it, and it was seldom that any of the Vestal priestesses availed themselves of the privilege. They generally remained, after their term of service had expired, in attendance at the temple, and died as they had lived in the service of the goddess. One of the chief functions of the virgins, in their service to the temple, was to keep the sacred fire perpetually burning. This fire was never to go out, and if, by any neglect on the part of the Vestal in attendance, this was allowed to occur, the guilty maiden was punished terribly by scourging. The punishment was inflicted by the hands of the highest pontifical officer of the state. The laws of the institution, however, evinced their high regard for the purity and modesty of the Vestal maidens, by requiring that the blows should be administered in the dark, the sufferer having been previously prepared to receive them by being partially undressed by her female attendants. The extinguished fire was then rekindled with many solemn ceremonies. Rhea Silvia, the mother of Romulus, was, we repeat, a Vestal Virgin. She lived 400 years after the death of Aeneas. During these 4 centuries, the kingdom had been governed by the descendants of Aeneas, generally in a peaceful and prosperous manner, although some difficulties occurred in the establishment of the succession immediately after Aeneas' death. It will be remembered that Aeneas was drowned during the continuance of the war. He left one son, and perhaps others. The one who figured most conspicuously in the subsequent history of the kingdom was Ascanius, the son who had accompanied Aeneas from Troy, one who now attained to years of maturity. He, of course, on his father's death, immediately succeeded him. There is some question, however, whether, after all, Lavinia herself was not entitled to the kingdom. It was doubtful, according to the laws and usages of those days, whether Aeneas held the realm in his own right, or as the husband of Lavinia, who was the daughter and heir of Latinus, the ancient and legitimate king. Lavinia, however, seemed to have no disposition to assert her claim. She was of a mild and gentle spirit, and besides, her health was at that time such as to lead her to wish for retirement and repose. She even had some fears for her personal safety, not knowing but that Ascanius would be suspicious and jealous of her on account of her claims to the throne, and that he might be tempted to do her some injury. Her husband had been her only protector among the Trojans, and now, since he was no more, and another, who was in some sense her rival, had risen to power, she naturally felt insecure. She accordingly took the first opportunity to retire from Lavinium. She went away into the forest in the interior of the country, with very few attendants and friends, and concealed herself there in a safe retreat. The family that received and sheltered her was that of Tereus, the chief of her father's shepherds, whose children's stag Ascanius had formerly killed. Here, in a short time, she had a son. She determined to name him from his father, and in order to commemorate his having been born in the midst of the wild forest scenes which surrounded her at the time of his birth, she called him in full Aeneas of the Woods, or, as it was expressed in the language which was then used in Latium, Aeneas Silvius. The boy, when he grew up, was always known by this name in subsequent history. And not only did he himself retain the name, but he transmitted it to his posterity, for all the kings that afterwards descended from him, extending in a long line through a period of 400 years, had the word Silvius affixed to their names, in perpetual commemoration of the romantic birth of their ancestor. Rhea, the mother of Romulus, of whom we have already spoken, and of whom we shall presently have occasion to speak still more, was Rhea Silvia, by reason of her having been by birth a princess of this royal line. Ascanius, in the meantime, on the death of his father, was for a time so engrossed in the prosecution of the war, that he paid but little attention to the departure of Lavinia. The name of the king of the Rutulians who fought against him was Mezentius. Mezentius had a son named Lausus, and both father and son were personally serving in the army by which Ascanius was besieged in Lavinium. Mezentius had command in the camp, in the headquarters of the army, which was at some distance from the city. Lausus headed an advanced guard, which had established itself strongly at a post which they had taken near the gates. In this state of things, Ascanius, one dark and stormy night, planned a sortie. He organized a desperate body of followers, and after watching the flashes of lightning for a time, to find omens from them indicating success, he gave the signal. The gates were opened, and the column of armed men sallied forth, creeping noiselessly forward in the darkness and gloom, until they came to the encampment of Lausus. They fell upon this camp with an irresistible rush, and with terrific shouts and outcries. The whole detachment were taken entirely by surprise, and great numbers were made prisoners or slain. Lausus himself was killed. Excited by their victory, the Trojan soldiers, headed by Ascanius, now turned their course toward the main body of the Rutulian army. Mezentius had, however, in the meantime, obtained warning of their approach, and when they reached his camp he was ready to retreat. He fled with all his forces toward the mountains. Ascanius and the Trojans followed him. Mezentius halted and attempted to fortify himself on a hill. Ascanius surrounded the hill, and soon compelled his enemies to come to terms. A treaty was made, and Mezentius and his forces soon after withdrew from the country, leaving Ascanius and Latium in peace. Ascanius then, after having in some degree settled his affairs, began to think of Lavinia. In fact, the Latin portion of his subjects seemed disposed to murmur and complain at her having been compelled to withdraw from her own paternal kingdom, in order to leave the throne to the occupancy of the son of a stranger. Some even feared that she had come to some harm, or that Ascanius might in the end put her to death when time had been allowed for the recollection of her to pass in some degree from the minds of men. So the public began generally to call for Lavinia's return. Ascanius seems to have been well disposed to do justice in the case, for he not only sought out Lavinia and induced her to return to the capital with her little son, but he finally concluded to give up Lavinium to her entirely, as her own rightful dominion, while he went away and founded a new city for himself. He accordingly explored the country around for a favourable site, and at length decided upon a spot nearly north of Lavinium, and not many miles distant from it. The place which he marked out for the walls of the city was at the foot of a mountain, on a tract of somewhat elevated ground, which formed one of the lower declivities of it. The mountain, arising abruptly on one side, formed a sure defence on that side. On the other side was a small lake, of clear and pellucid water. In front, and somewhat below, there were extended plains of fertile land. Ascanius, after having determined on this place as the site of his intended city, set his men to work to make the necessary constructions. Some built the walls of the city, and laid out streets and erected houses within. Others were employed in forming the declivity of the mountain above into terraces, for the cultivation of the vine. The slopes which they thus graded had a southern exposure, and the grapes which subsequently grew there were luxurious and delicate in flavour. From the little lake channels were cut, leading over the plains below, and by this means a constant supply of water could be conveyed to the fields of grain, which were to be sown there, for purposes of irrigation. Thus the place which Ascanius chose furnished all possible facilities, both for maintaining and also for defending the people who were to make it their abode. The town was called Alba Longa, that is, Long Alba. It was called Long to distinguish it from another Alba. It was really long in its form, as the buildings extended for a considerable distance along the border of the lake. Ascanius reigned over 30 years at Alba Longa, while Lavinia reigned at Lavinium, each friendly to the other and governing the country at large, together in peace and harmony. In process of time both died. Ascanius left a son whose name was Ulus, while Aeneas Silvius was Lavinia's heir. There was, of course, great diversity of opinion throughout the nation in regard to the comparative claims of these two princes respectively. Some maintained that Aeneas the Trojan became, by conquest, the rightful sovereign of Latium, regardless of any rights that he acquired through his marriage with Lavinia, and that Ulus, as the son of his eldest son, rightfully succeeded him. Others contended that Lavinium represented the ancient and truly legitimate royal line, and that Aeneas Silvius, as their son and heir, ought to be placed upon the throne. And there were those who proposed to compromise the question by dividing Latium into two separate kingdoms, giving up one part to Iulus with Alba Longa for its capital, and the other, with Lavinium for its capital, to Aeneas Silvius, Lavinia's heir. This proposition was however overruled. The two kingdoms thus formed would be small and feeble, it was thought, and unable to defend themselves against the other Italian nations in case of war. The question was finally settled by a different sort of compromise. It was agreed that Latium should retain its integrity, and that Aeneas Silvius, being the son both of Aeneas and Lavinia, and thus representing both branches of the reigning power, should be the king, while Iulus and his descendants forever should occupy the position, scarcely less inferior, of sovereign power in matters of religion. Aeneas Silvius, therefore, and his descendants became kings, and as such commanded the armies and directed the affairs of state, while Iulus and his family were exalted, in connection with them, to the highest pontifical dignities. This state of things, once established, continued age after age, and century after century, for about 400 years. No records, and very few traditions in respect to what occurred during this period remain. One circumstance, however, took place which caused itself to be remembered. There was one king in the line of the Silvii, whose name was Tiberinus. In one of his battles with the armies of the nation adjoining him on the northern side, he attempted to swim across the river that formed the frontier. He was forced down by the current, and was seen no more. By the accident, however, he gave the name of Tiber to the stream, and thus perpetuated his own memory through the subsequent renown of the river in which he was drowned. Before this time the river was called the Albula. Another incident is related, which is somewhat curious, as illustrating the ideas and customs of the times. One of this Silvian line of sovereigns was named Aladius. This Aladius conceived the idea of making the people believe that he was a god, and in order to accomplish this end he resorted to the contrivance of imitating, by artificial means, the sound of the rumbling of thunder and the flashes of lightning at night from his palace on the banks of the lake at Alba Longa. He employed, probably for this purpose, some means similar to those resorted to for the same end in theatrical spectacles at the present day. The people, however, were not deceived by this imposture, though they soon after fell into an error nearly as absurd as believing in this false thunder would have been, for on an occasion which occurred not long afterward, probably that of a great storm accompanied with torrents of rain upon the mountains around, the lake rose so high as to produce an inundation, in which the water broke into the palace, and the pretended thunderer was drowned. The people considered that he was destroyed thus by the special interposition of heaven, to punish him for his impiety in daring to assume what was then considered the peculiar attribute and prerogative of supreme divinity. In fact, the rumour circulated, and one historian has recorded it as true, that Aladius was struck by the lightning which accompanied the storm, and thus killed at once by the terrible agency which he had presumed to counterfeit, before the inundation of the palace came on. If he met his death in any sudden and unusual manner, it is not at all surprising that his fate should have been attributed to the judgment of God, for thunder was regarded in those days with an extreme and superstitious veneration and awe. All this is, however, now changed. Men have learned to understand thunder and to protect themselves from its power, and now, since Franklin and Morse have commenced the work of subduing the potent and mysterious agent in which it originates, to the human will, the presumption is not very strong against the supposition that the time may come when human science may actually produce it in the sky, as it is now produced, in effect, upon the lecturer's table. At last, toward the close of the 400 years during which the dynasty of the Silvia continued to reign over Latium, a certain monarch of the series died, leaving two children, Numitor and Amulius. Numitor was the eldest son, and as such entitled to succeed his father, but he was of a quiet and somewhat inefficient disposition, while his younger brother was ardent and ambitious, and very likely to aspire to the possession of power. The father, it seems, anticipated the possibility of dissension between his sons after his death, and in order to do all in his power to guard against it, he endeavoured to arrange and settle the succession before he died. In the course of the negotiations which ensued, Amulius proposed that his father's possessions should be divided into two portions, the kingdom to constitute one, and the wealth and treasures the other, and that Numitor should choose which portion he would have. This proposal seemed to have the appearance, at least, of reasonableness and impartiality, and it would have been really very reasonable if the right to the inheritance thus disposed of had belonged equally to the younger and to the elder son. But it did not, and thus the author of Amulius was, in effect, a proposition to divide with himself that which really belonged wholly to his brother. Numitor, however, who, it seems, was little disposed to contend for his rights, agreed to this proposal. He, however, chose the kingdom and left the wealth for his brother, and the inheritance was accordingly thus divided on the death of the father. But Amulius, as soon as he came into possession of his treasures, began to employ them as a means of making powerful friends, and strengthening his political influence. In due time he usurped the throne, and Numitor, giving up the contest with very little attempt to resist usurpation, fled and concealed himself in some obscure place of retreat. He had, however, two children, a son and a daughter, which he left behind him in his flight. Amulius feared that these children might, at some future time, give him trouble, by advancing claims as their father's heirs. He did not dare to kill them openly, for fear of exciting the popular odium against himself. He was obliged, therefore, to resort to stratagem. The son, whose name was Aegisthus, he caused to be slain at a hunting party, by employing remorseless and desperate men to shoot him, in the heat of the chase, with arrows, or thrusting through with a spear, watching their opportunity for doing this at a moment when they were not observed, or when it might appear to be an accident. The daughter, whose name was Rhea, the Rhea Silvia named at the commencement of this chapter, he could not well actually destroy, without being known to be her murderer, and perhaps too he had enough remaining humanity to be unwilling to shed the blood of a helpless and beautiful maiden, the daughter too of his own brother. Then besides he had a daughter of his own named Antho, who was the playmate and companion of Rhea, and with whose affection for her cousin he must have felt some sympathy. He would not, therefore, destroy the child, but contented himself with determining to make her a Vestal Virgin. By this means she would be solemnly set apart to a religious service from aspiring to the throne, and by being cut off, by her Vestal vows, from all possibility of forming any domestic ties. She could never, he thought, have any offspring to dispute his claim to the throne. There was nothing very extraordinary in this consecration of his niece, princess as she was, to the service of the Vestal fire, for it had been customary for children of the highest rank to be designated to this office. The little Rhea, for she was yet a child when her uncle took this determination in respect to her, made, as it would appear, no objection to what she perhaps considered a distinguished honour. The ceremonies, therefore, of her consecration were duly performed. She took the vows and bound herself by the most awful sanctions, unconscious, however, perhaps herself of what she was doing, to lead thenceforth a life of absolute celibacy and seclusion. She was then received into the temple of Vesta, and there, with the other maidens who had been consecrated before her, she devoted herself to the discharge of the duties of her office, without reproach, for several years. At length, however, certain circumstances occurred, which suddenly terminated Rhea's career as a Vestal Virgin, and led to results of the most momentous character. What these circumstances were will be explained in the next chapter. End of chapter 7.